Welcome back, brothers and heretics, to Warhammer. Tonight's story, we dive into the lore of the Crimson Sabres, which is perhaps the most tragic Space Marine chapter. Before we get into the madness, be sure to like, comment any videos and topics you want to see in the future. Be sure to subscribe for the Emperor. I want to thank you guys for support. I've been killing it like always. Now, let's get into the video.
The hive world of Vanik Secundus had been dying for 113 days, and death had worn grooves into it as deeply as the transit lines scored its skin. From orbit, the planet seemed less a world than a wound. Hive spires stabbed up through a pall of industrial ash and chemstorm bruise cloud, their upper reaches lit by lance fire and the intermittent flare of collapsing void shields. Along the equatorial belts, manufactoria burned in continent-long chains, furnace districts vomiting black smoke into a sky already thick with promethium haze. Defense platforms hung above the world like iron saints, many crippled, some drifting dead, the rest still laboring to cast their wrath down upon rebellious districts where the heretic banners of the uprising had not yet been burned away. Beneath them, millions of Imperial guardsmen fought and died in trench mazes of ferrocrete, in arterial roads choked by wrecked armor, in underhive sump tunnels rank with rot and old machine oil. Basilisks barked from hidden redoubts. Shadow Zords traded annihilation with traitor engines along the causeways that linked one hive cluster to the next. Entire battalions vanished beneath macro barrage and were replaced by fresh columns before the smoke had thinned over the meat and shattered flak plate they left behind. It had been a war of attrition until the Crimson Sabres made translation into the outer reaches of the system. Then it became arithmetic. The fleet arrived without spectacle. No triumphal hymns flooded the command vox. No gilded declarations of deliverance were transmitted to the desperate commanders below. The battle barge Red Honor descended from the dark with its escorts around it like the blades of a crown, crimson hulls bearing white sigils of office and kill scrolls older than kingdoms. Attack runes spread across the command hololiths of the embattled Imperial command echelons with machine precision. Firing solutions were requested. Orbital lines were partitioned. Drop vectors were assigned. Civilian density estimates were amended downward. Suppression grids were marked in hard red. The first order the world heard from the Crimson Sabres was not a promise. It was a correction. "Your northern cordon is wasteful," came the voice over the theater command channel, iron flat, stripped of all humanity by helm vox and discipline. "You are feeding ammunition into ground already rendered irrelevant. Reassign 6 regiments to hive interior encirclement. Withdraw your armor from the Basilica district. That objective now belongs to the Adeptus Astartes." The men and officers of Vanik Secundus obeyed, because the speaker was a space marine, and because there was something in his tone that made disobedience sound less like error than sacrilege. Chapter Master Sevastus Cranon stood in the launch bay of the Red Honor, while the gunship decks howled around him. He wore crimson warplate with white shoulder guards, each edge trimmed in battle-scored gold. Purity seals clung to his cuirass like strips of flayed skin. His helm was mag-locked at his hip. The scars that marked his face were old, pale and straight, like cuts made not by frenzy, but by exacting hands. Around him stood the veterans of the spear-tip assault, men of the 1st and 4th, terminators waiting in statuesque silence, line sergeants conducting final weapon diagnostics, serfs moving between giants with bowed heads and trembling hands. A hololith of the target district burned before Cranon, St. Caldrus Basilica, Rebel Command Sanctum, Central Cogitation Relay, Anti-Orbital Auger Nexus, defended by an estimated 12,000 armed traitors and several companies of defected enforcers. The world below had failed to take it for 61 days. Cranon studied it for another 2 heartbeats and then spoke. "Time to reduction?" A captain of the bridge staff answered at once. "Projected by local command, 2 days, Lord." Cranon's lip curled as though at a foul odor. "Incorrect. 8 minutes to breach, 17 to command decapitation, 23 to district compliance." He looked across his warriors, and though he did not raise his voice, every engine thrum and warning klaxon in that immense chamber seemed to recede before it. Victory is not enough. Victory must be pure. There was no cheer. There was only the single thunder of armored fists striking breastplates in acknowledgement. Far below, in the underworks of Hive Tertius, Scout Sergeant Anzo Riegler moved through darkness thick as clotting blood. The passages beneath the Basilica district were ancient service arteries, where heat pipes sweated scalding condensation, and bundles of half-insulated cable hung like gut ropes from rusted vaulting. His scout armor drank the gloom. His squad ghosted behind him, camo cloaks breaking their outlines into strips of moving shadow. Every few moments their Auspex lenses flickered with static from the overworked generators above. Anzo raised a clenched fist. His men froze as one. Ahead, voices. Not rebels, not yet. Imperial guardsmen. They huddled in a maintenance alcove behind a barricade of cargo crates and broken shrine statuary, faces grey with fatigue, laser guns clasped in shaking hands. One was reciting a prayer to the throne through split lips. Another had his helmet off and was vomiting into the sump runnel at his feet. Their lieutenant, a gaunt male officer with one augmetic eye, heard the scrape of ceramite on rusted deck and swung his weapon up in panic. Anzo stepped into view. The lieutenant's fear did not lessen when he saw the red armor and white shoulder plate. It worsened. "Lord Astartes," the man breathed, and then, with the desperation of one trying to appease a predator, "We held the access route as ordered. We held. By the throne, we did not fall back." Anzo's gaze moved over the barricade, the spent charge packs, the dead rebel bodies piled in the adjoining tunnel. The guardsmen had fought hard. They stank of blood, exhaust, and terror. "How many munitions expended?" he asked. The lieutenant blinked. "My lord? How many?" The man swallowed. "I do not have the exact count." Anzo did not move. "Then your accounting is deficient." The lieutenant looked as if he had been struck. One of the guardsmen lowered his eyes. Another crossed himself in the sign of the Aquila, not in reverence but in dread. They knew the reputation. Everyone who had fought beside the Crimson Sabers knew it. The red-armored angels of death would hold the line no matter the cost. They would strike with impossible swiftness. They would not fail. And when the killing was done, they would catalogue every error made by mortal hands with a pitiless exactitude that left men wishing they had died in the assault. "We require passage to the sub-vault ingress," Anzo said. The lieutenant stammered directions. Anzo listened, corrected the man's estimate of the distance from the cartograph in his helm display, then moved on without another word. Behind him, one of the guardsmen let out a breath so ragged it was almost a sob. Brother Silas came up beside him, his whisper a ghost in the squad vox. "They fear us more than the heretics." "They fear judgment," Anzo replied. "There is little difference." Anzo did not answer. Ahead lay the sub-vault gate, a slab of riveted adamantine bearing fresh weld scars where the rebels had tried to seal it. He gave the order. Melter charges bloomed white-hot against the metal. The gate sagged inward, vomiting sparks and a wash of furnace air. The scouts entered at a run, blades and bolt carbines ready, moving into the lungs of the dying hive, while high above them, the sky began to scream. Thunderhawks came down through the ash clouds in disciplined spearheads, not a wild rush of descent, but a measured execution. Their engines carved the sky apart. Fire from surviving flak towers reached up to meet them and died beneath pinpoint orbital suppression. Each emplacement annihilated a heartbeat before it could track the incoming craft. Drop pods hammered into plaza stone around St. Caldrus Basilica in precise concentric rings, retro thrusters blasting masonry into storms of dust and bone fragments. The pods burst open, and crimson figures strode into gunfire as though entering rain. No battle cry rolled from them, no oath of glory, only clipped vox orders. First breach point secure. Devastators, lane theta, fire. Fourth advance by squads, no drift. Purge transept, leave the icon wall intact for assessment. The rebels inside the basilica died in layers. Heavy bolter fire scythed the nave into red ruin, explosive rounds turning torsos into sprays of ribs and organ slurry that slapped wetly against the carved saints of the walls. Assault squads came down through shattered rose windows in storms of glass and jump pack flame, chainswords howling as they opened men from throat to groin and cast steaming loops of viscera across the altar steps. Terminators smashed through the western apse with thunderhammers and power fists, reducing gun nests and flesh alike to paste. The floor ran black-red with blood and sacred oils. Incense burners toppled into heaps of dead, filling the sanctuary with the smell of burning perfume, ruptured bowels and promethium. Crannan entered through the main doors after his warriors had already broken the enemy's spine. Bolter rounds sparked from his armor. He ignored them. A rebel priest in shredded vestments lunged from behind a statue with a chain axe held in both hands, shrieking invocations to powers he did not understand. Crannan shot him once through the mouth. The back of the priest's skull burst apart in a red fan that painted a martyr's mosaic across the chapel wall. "Command sanctuary," Crannan voxed. "Above the choir vault," came the reply. He took the stairway at a measured stride, his honor guard with him. At the top awaited the leaders of the uprising, a knot of officers and rogue preachers around a cogitator altar choked with devotional parchment and spent shell casings. One tried to speak, another raised a pistol, a third fell to his knees and began to beg. Crannan slew them all before the first full sentence was uttered. Below, the city was already collapsing into compliance. Loyalist guard formations, directed now by Astartes' battle calculus, advanced through cleared avenues with renewed order. Rebel resistance points were isolated and extinguished. Ammunition dumps were secured. Water reclamation plants were retaken. Vox spires resumed transmission. In less than half an hour, the district that had devoured regiments was reduced to mapped kill zones, execution sites, and triage sectors. By nightfall, St. Caldrus and the surrounding hive quarter belonged to the Imperium again. That was when General Heth, Malrek, requested audience. He came into the command precinct in a coat stiff with grime and a shoulder wound bandaged beneath his officer's sash. He was a hard-faced man who had held a broken war together for months and buried more soldiers than some worlds had ever raised. Yet in the presence of the Crimson Sabers, he seemed diminished, merely another supplicant under the gaze of unforgiving gods. Crannan stood with Captain Eli Zartan and Chief Librarian Zastus Manon amid the broken command nave, tactical projections swimming in pale light over blood-slick flagstones. Chaplains in black stood along the edges like executioners awaiting sentence. Malrek bowed. "Chapter Master, by order of the Lord Militant and in the name of the throne, I offer gratitude. Without your intervention..." Crannan cut him off with a slight tilt of his head. "Your gratitude has no tactical value." The general stiffened. "My lord, I meant only to acknowledge you committed 3 armored brigades to the outer district approaches after the enemy had already abandoned them. You expended anti-fortification shells against targets that infantry flamers could have cleansed at 1/20th the cost. Your reserve lines were too shallow. Your munitions ledgers are incomplete. Your subsector command failed to preserve ammunition ratios under prolonged siege conditions." Each sentence landed like a hammer blow. Officers and serfs standing nearby lowered their eyes. Malrek's jaw clenched, but he did not dare answer in anger. "We held as we could," he said at last. Crannan stepped closer. The chapter master did not loom by intention. It was simply what he was. "You held poorly. That you held at all is the minimum expected of servants of the Emperor. Do not seek praise for survival." Malrek bowed his head. The shame in the man's face was raw enough to cut. Crannan turned away before the general was dismissed, as though the matter had already consumed too much time. Afterward, the masters of the chapter gathered in a side chapel whose saints had been decapitated by shell bursts and whose floor was still tacky with blood. Crannan stood at the head of the strategium hololith. Manon's hood cast his pale features into gaunt shadow. Eli Zartan stood broad and motionless, hands locked behind his back, his expression carved from old stone. Chaplains, captains, and senior serfs arrayed themselves by rank and silence. "The city is compliant," said Captain Braglan Ragnald. "Casualty estimates remain incomplete." "Then make them complete," Crannan said. Manon's eyes, dark and deep-set, moved to the hololithic overlays of surviving population zones. Residual contamination persists in the hab rings around the Basilica district. Deviant devotional markers, rebel familial ties, unverified labor cadres. There is statistical risk. "Probability?" Crannan asked. "Non-compliance resurgence within 6 months if left." "Untreated is high." Zartan looked at the display, then at Crannan. "High is not certainty." Crannan met his gaze. "The Codex does not require certainty before excision." One of the chaplains, Okrak, inclined his skull-helmed head. "Mercy is a luxury of secure realms. We stand in a diseased age." "Aye," said another captain. "Weakness survives by naming itself compassion." The words were spoken with the ease of men reciting doctrine learned so long ago it had become marrow-deep. Yet beneath the discipline was something harsher, a pressure old as grievance. Rogon lived in that chamber, though the world itself had long been poisoned. The memory of its death clung to them like ash under paint. Their first homeworld had burned while aid came late, or not at all. Their distress had been docketed, delayed, answered with excuses and statistical inevitabilities. They had rebuilt upon Drogsh, raised their fortress anew, polished their record until it shone like a blade, and in return had found only suspicion, distance, and the stale condescension of those who spoke of brotherhood while measuring bloodlines and precedents. "We were abandoned once," said Crannan, as if voicing the thought that moved beneath every other. "We will not abandon duty in answer. If there is rot, we cut it out." No one challenged him. The purge orders went out before the hour was done. Not a rampage, not drunken cruelty, not the messy savagery of unbound men. A procedure. Hab blocks in the ring districts were identified by probability matrices drawn from rebel affiliation, devotional drift, interrupted tithe patterns, population movement, and munitions theft reports. Squads were assigned. Approach routes were mapped. Civilian egress windows were denied on the grounds that contamination vectors could not be adequately segregated under present conditions. Guard auxilia were ordered to establish perimeter cordons and fire on anyone attempting to break them. Then the Crimson Sabres began their secondary cleansing. Anzo Riegler moved with his scouts through a worker hab where the corridors smelled of boiled starch, machine grease, and fear. Families crowded in rooms barely large enough for their own breathing. Men shouted denials through locked doors. Children cried. The first breach charge took a metal portal off its hinges and sent it cartwheeling down the passage. Beyond it, a knot of hab residents had armed themselves with industrial cutters, pry bars, and one ancient shotgun. One man, greased to the elbows, tried to shield an old patriarch behind him. "We are loyal," he shouted. Brother Treborek shot him through the chest. The bolt burst inside his thorax, spraying the walls with gobbets of lung and splintered sternum. The old man behind him took the next round in the throat and drowned in his own blood in 3 choking heartbeats. Room by room, level by level, the purge advanced with dreadful orderliness. Auspex sweeps. Identification, execution, marking, advance. In another block, flamers turned a shrine cellar into a furnace, while occupants beat at the sealed hatches until their hands peeled. In the transit galleries, devastators fired down fleeing columns with controlled bursts that reduced bodies to tumbling meat and snapped limbs. Medici reports were logged, ammunition tallies updated, purity prayers intoned. From a command balcony overlooking the smoke-clogged district, Manon watched the cull in silence. The battle below no longer sounded like battle. It sounded like industry. Then he felt it. A pressure on the edge of perception, so faint that for a heartbeat, he thought it only the aftertaste of warp translation. But no, it lingered. Not a voice. Not yet. More the sensation of a nail dragging slowly across the inside of reality. Something behind the veil. Something aware. Manon's eyes narrowed. Psychic wards flickered instinctively through his mind. The pressure withdrew, only to leave behind a tremor in his thoughts. Cranon came to stand beside him, helm under one arm, the light of burning habs moving across his scarred face. "You sense something?" the chapter master said. "A dissonance," Manon replied. "Thin, distant, as if the Imperium has taken note." Cranon looked over the city with no sign of fear. "The age is foul," he said. "Every campaign proves it anew. Then the answer remains the same. Harder discipline, swifter purgation." Manon did not contradict him. He watched the smoke rise, black against the hive's sickly lumen glow, and wondered why the feeling in the warp had seemed so much like amusement. Hours later, as the last purge zones were being sealed, and the dead entered into the ledgers of the righteous, a vermilion priority astropathic signal screamed into the red honor. The bridge dimmed under emergency lumen wash. Servitors chattered in Binharic. The message came fractured by distance and warp scar, but its meaning was plain enough. Umidia, jungle world, heretic contamination suspected, inquisitorial oversight compromised, escalating local collapse, immediate Astartes intervention demanded in the name of the throne. Cranon heard it in full. So did Manon. So did Zartan, Anzo, and every officer summoned to the strategium as the last embers of Vanik Secundus still drifted upward from the world below. No one spoke for several moments. Then Cranon set his helm upon his head. The seals clamped shut with a predator's finality. "Make ready the fleet," he said. "We translate for Umidia at once." No prayer followed, no debate, no hesitation, only obedience, only engines awakening, only the red blade of the chapter turning toward its next wound. This chapter keeps to the Crimson Sabres canon frame as a ruthlessly codex-bound chapter under Sevastus Cranon, with Zastus Manon, Eli Zartan, and Anzo Riegler in place before Umidia, alongside their bitterness after Rogon and Drogsh. The warp cast them out above Umidia, beneath a vault of storm clouds so immense it seemed the world had drawn a shroud over its own face. From the command oculus of the Red Honor, Umidia showed itself in flashes of sickly lightning and rolling black vapor. There were no comforting hive lights, no lattices of ordered habitation, no broad continental scars of manufactorum spread. The world below was green in the way gangrene was green, thick with a jungle canopy so vast and unbroken that it resembled a single living hide stretched across the planet. Mountain chains rose from it like the knuckles of a buried corpse. Rivers cut through it in black coils, glinting only when lightning struck. Here and there, amid the choking breadth of growth, stood temple cities and survey bastions built by men long dead, their towers half consumed by root and vine. Auspex sweeps returned sickened data. Heat blooms appeared and vanished. Entire valleys simply drank active scans and gave back nothing. Atmospheric interference rolled across the hololiths like blood in water. It was not a dead world. It was not even a silent one. Every long-range reading suggested movement in impossible volumes. Biomass shifting, moisture rising, whole sections of canopy flexing beneath unseen winds. It looked less like terrain than respiration. Chief Librarian Zastus Manon stood near the primary projection dais, his hood drawn, his gaunt face lit by unstable green light. The veins at his temples pulsed as he watched the Auspex shadows pulse and blur. "It feels veiled," he said at last. Captain Eli Zartan folded his arms over his breastplate. By weather. Manon did not take his eyes from the display. By intention. Cranon stood upon the command dais in full warplate, helm maglocked, his white shoulder guard marked by old campaign badges and purity wards. He regarded the planet as though it were merely another tactical obstruction to be reduced. The distress signal, named heretic contamination. It named much and confirmed little, said Zartan. It was sent in vermilion priority under inquisitorial cipher. Cranon's tone made the matter simple. That suffices. Servitors clattered through data rights nearby. Bridge officers passed target strings to waiting serfs. The fleet held at high anchor, while attack vectors were calculated and revised. Somewhere in the decks below, Thunderhawks were already being armed. An incoming Vox burst, crackled across the bridge. Static screamed over it like something alive. Then a man's voice punched through, ragged, exhausted, close to breaking. By the throne respond. This is Interrogator Halbrecht of the Holy Ordos. Respond. The infection is no longer localized. Repeat, no longer localized. Hidden cults, embedded across shrine populations and labor settlements. Ritual gatherings masked as harvest vigils. We attempted quarantine. Emperor preserve us, they were already inside the cordon. The transmission fractured into shrieks of distortion. For a moment another voice overlapped his, thin and ululating, perhaps only warp scrape, perhaps something else. Halbrecht returned in gasping fragments. They wear the faces of the faithful. They gather under masks. Fires in the tree line, glyphs in blood. We found the skin-hung totems after dusk. Not all readings are true. Some are bait. Some are... Static devoured him. Then one final coherent phrase emerged. Do not trust the villagers. Silence followed. Cranon inclined his head by a fraction. There. Confirmation. Zartan looked at him. Confirmation of danger, not of planetary apostasy. Cranon turned from the oculus and faced his assembled officers. Around him stood the masters of the chapter, captains and chaplains, line officers and veteran sergeants, all waiting for the shape of war to be spoken into law. If rot is found in one artery, Cranon said, cut to the bone. No man. They doubted his meaning. Once spoken, the sentence passed through the chamber like a blade through cloth, clean, certain, irreversible. Orders followed with machine exactitude. The 10th Company would descend first under Scout Sergeant Anzo Riegler and establish reconnaissance webs around the primary distress sectors. Librarians would accompany the first main wave elements to verify warp taint. The 1st, 4th, and supporting companies would deploy by spearhead assault into the largest temple settlements and transit clearances. Orbital suppression would remain on ready status. Population movement was to be treated as contamination spread until proven otherwise. Anzo Riegler made planetfall beneath a sky the color of bruised iron. His storm landed in a clearing hacked from the jungle by old survey crews generations before. Rain hissed on the hull and came down so thick it looked like hanging chain. The moment the ramp dropped, the jungle smell hit him through his helm filters. Wet rot, flowering sweetness already turning sour, mud, spores, old leaves, stagnant water, and something beneath it all that reminded him too strongly of fresh opened viscera. His scouts vanished into the green with practiced silence. Cloaks broke their outlines. Auspec's whispers passed over Squadvox. The jungle around them seethed with life. Insects shrilled from unseen pools. Branches bowed beneath the weight of climbing things that slithered away before lenses could fix on them. Towering trees climbed into darkness so dense their crowns stitched a roof over the world. Creepers thick as a man's torso looped from trunk to trunk. Fungal blooms the size of helmets glimmered faintly in the shadows. They found the first bodies by a shrine path. 3 men of the local defense militia had been nailed to a tree in poses of worship, hands spread, heads bowed, their guts opened and draped around their waists like priestly cords. Flies boiled over the exposed organs. Their faces were hidden by crude wooden masks shaped like beaks. Beneath them, ritual fires had been built in neat circles using split femurs and polished skulls. Brother Silas crouched and touched one ember with a gloved fingertip. Recent. Anzo's autosenses scanned the corpses. The masks were coated in pigments made from mud, ash, and blood. Symbols had been carved into the bark behind them, but no machine catalogue matched them cleanly. Some resembled devotional script. Others looked more like talons dragged across flesh. "Mark and advance," Anzo voxed. They found more before dawn. Fire pits in abandoned crop terraces, empty villages where meals still steamed in bowls, while doors swung open to the rain. Totems of bound reeds and finger bones hanging from shrine arches. Men glimpsed between the trunks, wearing long reed cloaks and bird masks, vanishing before bolter sights could settle. A procession of figures carrying lanterns through the undergrowth, chanting in low voices until the jungle swallowed sound itself. Each contact was enough to damn the world. Together they formed a pattern too perfect to ignore, and yet there were flaws in it. At one abandoned hamlet, Anzo's auspex registered more heartbeats than his eyes could account for. In another, a statue of an imperial saint wept fresh blood from stone sockets, but when Brother Carthan cut into the icon, there were only nesting insects and old cracks within. Twice the scouts tracked movement across the canopy, only to find no spore, no broken branch, nothing save an impossible concentration of heat hanging in mid-air like a phantom. When Anzo reported upward, he gave the facts without interpretation. Crannan supplied the interpretation for him. "Cult activity confirmed in distributed pattern," the chapter master said over command vox. "Masking rituals. Population contamination probable. Escalation authorized." By the second watch, the fleet began to descend in wrath. Thunderhawks tore down through the cloud banks in disciplined formations, their engine roar making the jungle tremble. The storm struck them and burst around their hulls in sheets of white water. Behind them came the heavier landers, hauling land raiders, dreadnought sarcophagi, munitions pallets, and the steel weight of the chapter's certainty. Orbital guns opened on marked target zones, not with indiscriminate fury, but with measured, pitiless precision. Shrine avenues were cut apart. Tree lines exploded into fountains of sap, mud, and body parts where hidden camps had been identified. The jungle itself seemed to scream as macro shells tore open clearings deep enough to show bedrock. Crannan came down with the first spearhead into the temple settlement of Varan Reach, a place of stone causeways and high-roofed shrines built atop swamp pilings and half-drowned ruins. Villagers were running when his boots hit the landing court. Some carried bundles, some carried children, some simply fled the screaming descent of gunships and the concussion of bombardment with no thought in them save terror. The first quarantine command was issued in flawless Gothic over amplified vox. "Remain where you stand. Kneel. Display empty hands. Any movement beyond designated compliance parameters will be treated as corruption." Many did not understand the words through the thunder. Others understood and panicked anyway. A knot of men broke for the water stairs. Devastators on overwatch cut them apart in a single burst. Their bodies burst wetly, limbs spinning away into the reeds. A priest in stained green robes came out of a shrine doorway, clutching an Aquila icon and shouting something that Vox distortion reduced to a gargling frenzy. The nearest assault sergeant took him for a cult exhorter and split him from collar to navel with a chainsword. The spinning teeth chewed through ribs and spine and sent a steaming wash of intestines over the shrine threshold. Militia on a roofline saw red-armored giants descending through fire and raised their weapons in reflex. A predator annihilated the entire parapet in an instant, lasfire turning men and stone together into vaporous pink ruin. The crimson sabers advanced through Varan Reach with terrible purity of purpose. They did not bellow, they did not rage. Their violence was calmer than hatred, and therefore worse. Tactical sectors were assigned. Structures were categorized. Those marked suspect were breached and cleared. Those marked unsalvageable were burned. When villagers clustered at the edges of the settlement and screamed denials of guilt, chaplains ordered them driven back at bolter point until the press of bodies broke and those at the front fell under trampling feet. Where quarantine lines failed, flamers remade them in sheets of liquid fire. Further inland, the full grandeur of the assault unfolded. Land raiders smashed down shrine avenues older than imperial memory, crushing statuary and men together beneath grinding tracks. Dreadnoughts lumbered through burning foliage like walking tomb furnaces, multi-melters carving open hidden bunkers and vaporizing everything inside into greasy smoke. Whirlwind rockets arced over the canopy and came down among clustered villages, hurling roof thatch, timber and human fragments high into the rain. Assault squads leapt from tower to tower, while below them tactical marines advanced through waist-deep mud, bolters barking, each detonation sending pieces of cultist or peasant or panicked militiaman slapping against wet wood and mossy stone. Manon came down at Crannon's left flank, his psychic hood alive with witchlight. The librarians spread through the assault zones like divining knives, feeling for warp seepage, for demonic spore, for the hidden architecture of sorcery. They found enough to doom a world. In one shrine cellar, a picked wall of the Emperor shifted when viewed directly, his holy face stretching beak-like for the span of a breath before settling again. In the marshlands beyond Varan Reach, Brother Librarian Serevan tracked a column of masked figures through vapor, only to discover that their footprints sank too deep, as if far heavier things had worn those human shapes. Manon himself stood in a temple courtyard, where dozens of bodies had been laid in prayer circles, and felt the veil shiver. For a heartbeat, the corpses on the stones were not corpses, but bundles of feathered limbs, too many jointed, twitching beneath skin that was only pretending to be skin. Warp taint present, he voxed. That was enough. Perhaps it would have taken little enough, even without it. By the third day, Crannon had widened the scope of purgation from regional assault to planetary correction. Every village was to be screened, every shrine hierarchy interrogated, every population cluster treated as suspect until absolute purity could be proven. None could prove it to his standard. Anzo moved with the 10th through a chain of elevated walkways, linking jungle hamlets over black floodwater. Beneath them floated butchered livestock, idols hacked apart, and the swollen dead. The survivors he encountered no longer looked like a coherent people. Some tore off bird masks and swore loyalty to terror. Others clung to the masks as if afraid to remove them. Some had seen demons in the canopy. Some had only seen Astartes descend and open fire upon the first crowd that moved. All of them were trapped inside a nightmare too large to measure. At one way station, a line of locals stumbled toward the Crimson Sabers, with their hands raised, crying out prayers to the Emperor in mangled but recognizable liturgy. The rain hammered down. Vox static hissed. Over the din, their words became warped, syllables swallowed, endings drawn into strange cadences. Brother Halvek raised his bolter. "The prayer is wrong." "It is dialect," Anzo said. A gaunt old man at the front took another step. Someone behind him surged. The line wavered like a thing trying to break. "Hold!" Anzo barked. A shot cracked from somewhere in the jungle. Perhaps militia, perhaps cultist, perhaps nothing more than a fevered finger on a trigger. Halvek opened fire. Mass reactive rounds tore through the front rank and detonated inside packed flesh. Men came apart in showers of rib splinters and red vapor. The old man vanished from the waist up. Those behind him were thrown backward, shrieking, hands still raised as more shots came. In seconds, the walkway was a butcher's chute, rain washing blood through the slats in crimson streams. Anzo looked at the dead, at the remains still twitching, and said nothing. Around him, his brothers advanced over them, with the same relentless pace they would have used against any foe. The deeper the war drove, the stranger it became. Reports filtered upward of whole patrols, engaging masked enemies who burst apart into flocks of black-feathered things on death. A dreadnought swore that he had crushed a horned silhouette in the roots of a tree and found only rotting prayer books under his feet when the smoke cleared. Lightning without storms struck shrines and left no heat trace. Ponds reflected cities that did not exist. Men tore their own faces bloody, trying to rip off masks they had never worn. At the heart of the madness lay the settlement of Omlath, built around a sunken cathedral swallowed by roots and age. Halbrecht's final signal had originated there. Crannan led the converging assault personally. Thunderhawks strafed the surrounding tree line until it vomited burning sap. Land raiders crushed through the processional road. Terminators teleported into the nave amid shrieking static and burst apart the defenders in sprays of gore. Within the cathedral, they found the architect of it all, or so it seemed then. He stood upon the drowned altar in robes made of stitched skin, a bird mask of beaten gold over his face, his hands lifted as if in blessing. Around him circled figures in reed cloaks and blood-painted masks. Some were men, some were not, their limbs bending backward, their shadows too large for their bodies. Blue witch-fire danced over the old stones. The air stank of copper and wet feathers. "You came as foretold," the masked figure said, his voice layered and wrong. "Red suns, precise suns, the blade that cuts itself." Crannan answered with bolter fire. The altar exploded in shards. Bodies burst apart. The masked acolytes screamed as mass reactive shells turned them inside out, showering the nave with brains, splintered jawbone, and strips of flayed skin. Manon hurled psychic force into the churning dark, and for an instant the glamour over the place ripped. Anzo saw then what might have been true. Not all the figures on the floor were cultists. Some were temple attendants in ceremonial rain masks, the sort worn against insects and smoke. Some were shrine wardens with lass locks in shaking hands. One was interrogator Halbrecht, half flayed, eyes gone, his body wired upright against the altar as part warning, part puppet. The thing in the golden bird mask was real enough, but it wore illusion-like robes, drawing shapes over loyal flesh, baiting every righteous trigger pull. Crannan charged through the wreckage and struck it with his power sword. The mask split. For a heartbeat, there was a face beneath, too many eyes opening inside a human skull, a beak of light, a wet blossom of impossible anatomy pushing out through skin. Then the whole creature came apart in a scream of feathers, blood, and warp fire. The cathedral shook. The surviving masked figures ran in all directions, some mutating as they fled, others simply men slipping in gore and crying out to the Emperor. The crimson sabers shot them down alike. When the last guns fell silent, truth bled through too late. Across Umidia, reports corrected themselves in fragments no one wanted. Population rites mistaken for cult assemblies. Protective masks mistaken for blasphemous regalia. Defensive militia engagements interpreted as coordinated heretic resistance. Shrines burned because static turned prayer into gibberish. Whole villages annihilated because glamour and fear had twisted the eye. There had been corruption on Umidia. There had been demonic manipulation. There had been hidden murder cults, but not in every temple, not in every settlement, not in every man who had run from a descending gunship. The world below the fleet became a grave under rain. Rivers ran red-brown with blood and loosened earth. Burned villages smoked through the jungle canopy like cauterized wounds. Bodies hung in the roots where flood waters had carried them. Armor boots sank ankle-deep in ash, pulp, and scattered organs. Helm lenses tracked no more meaningful targets. There was nothing left to purge that had not already been fed into the furnace of certainty. Anzo stood at the edge of a riverbank choked with corpses and watched a child's carved, Devotional charm drift between severed limbs and burst bellies. Behind him, his brothers moved among the dead in silence, red armor blackened by soot and gore. No victory rites were spoken. No thanks were given to the throne. Even the chaplains had fallen mute. Crannan looked upon the slaughtered valley from a ridge of black stone and said nothing at all. Manon removed his helm. Rain coursed over his pallid features. He stared into the jungle and listened. At first, there was only water, distant fire, the settling crack of ruined wood. Then, very softly, from nowhere and everywhere at once, a voice whispered behind his thoughts. Why? He stiffened. Another came, then another. Not loud, not demonic thunder. Merely the low, intimate murmur of the dead when they find they have not been granted silence. By nightfall, other brothers had begun to turn their helms, as if hearing things in the rain. One clenched his jaw hard enough to crack a tooth. Another looked back over an empty trail with bolter raised. Anzo heard nothing yet, but when he passed the heaps of butchered villagers and saw the masks half submerged in mud, he felt the shape of a question pressing against the inside of his skull. Umidia burned behind them, and the victors walked its corpse fields as if already being followed. The fleet rose from Umidia, carrying silence in its holds and slaughter in its wake, yet neither silence nor slaughter remained where the chapter had expected to find them. The dead came aboard with them, not in flesh, not in spirit form visible to the eye, not as the broad and obvious manifestations of a breach in reality that even a line brother could name and destroy with bolt, blade, and prayer. They came instead as pressure, as memory sharpened into hooks, as words breathed at the edge of hearing. At first it was easy for a battle brother to mistake the change for fatigue of the kind no space marine would ever admit. The Crimson Sabres had burned a world and marched across its corpse fields. Their armor was still caked in drying gore. Their lungs still carried the smoke of reed villages and temple pyres. Their eyes had watched innocent men die, and then learned, too late, that innocence had indeed been what had burst beneath their bolter fire. Astartes did not sleep as mortal men slept. They withdrew into disciplined rest state, lowered body demands, sharpened memory partitions, sealed away distraction and weakness by ritual, training, and sacred biology alike. On the first cycle after the fleet left Umidia, many entered that trance and found not the cool dark of controlled restoration, but a return. They saw the world again, not as campaign record, not as tactical replay, as accusation. Brother Narvek of the Third came half awake from his repose, with both gauntlets locked so tightly around the edge of his slab that the metal had bent in his grip. He had dreamed of a child whose lower jaw was gone. The child had not screamed. It had only stared and pointed at him with a hand that ended at the wrist. When Narvek broke trance, he found blood leaking from the meat of his palms, where his own fingers had cut through glove lining and into flesh. Brother Halvek did not dream at all. He heard. All through his meditation cycle, there was a single voice, that of an old man speaking in the rain, calm and bewildered, repeating the same 4 words over and over. I was praising him. Sergeant Vortan of the 7th, a veteran whose discipline had survived hive sieges, boarding hells, and 200 years of war, found himself unable to empty his mind for even a breath. Every catechism he recited returned to him altered by another tongue, speaking beneath his own. Praise to the Emperor became, "Why did you not see?" Litanies of absolution became, "We knelt." The harder he forced his focus into order, the more the words multiplied. Others heard no words at all, only screaming. The scream followed them into armories, into strategiums, into silent corridors lined by battle honors and the stone faces of dead chapter masters. It began faint and low, a pressure on the edge of hearing, then rose in waves until even transhuman concentration faltered beneath it. It sounded sometimes like one throat, sometimes like 10,000, sometimes like the creaking metal cry of the fleet itself. More than one line brother tore off his helm in fury, certain some damaged Vox component or hidden alarm had been left active within the suit systems. There was never any fault. The apothecarian decks filled. Apothecaries took gene samples, drew blood from thick veins under the neck seals, inspected the black carapace sockets, ran auger wands over cortical implants and catalepsian nodes, measured heart rhythm under meditative stress, checked for toxin residues and spore of psychic contamination. They bored into progenoid matrices with sacred needles and extracted samples from the neck glands of veterans who had not removed their armor. Fully in months. White tiles ran slick with diluted blood and nutrient fluids. Serrated medici arms folded and unfolded from the ceiling like patient insects, while red-armored giants sat rigid beneath them and endured examinations that would have broken mortal men into shrieking madness. No flaw was found, no corruption of gene seed, no measurable lesion, no chemical degradation, no identifiable parasite. Their flesh remained that of Adeptus Astartes. Their organs answered to all expected thresholds. Their blood was clean. Their minds were not. The chaplains answered the absence of material fault with excess of ritual. Soon the fleet's chapels were never empty. Battle brothers knelt in armor before iron shrines black with candle soot, while skull-helmed priests struck deck plates with Crozius hafts and intoned penitential cycles until the air shook with them. Confession rites lengthened. Self-mortification was sanctioned. Chains were wrapped around bare forearms. Blade edges were drawn across scar tissue in old patterns of remembrance and submission. Honor rolls were read aloud in reverse order, so that the living heard the dead named before their own. In the lower sanctums, some brothers knelt so long that servo joints locked and had to be manually released by armor serfs. The rites did not cure the haunting. They only made its presence more intimate. When the chanting ceased, the whispers rushed back in to fill the silence. Scout Sergeant Anzo Riegler learned of the chapter's fracture first, in the places where rank thinned and discipline showed its strain most clearly. He passed through the lower launch galleries and saw a veteran of the 4th standing alone before a wall shrine, helm under one arm, whispering in a voice too low to pass. There was no one with him, no vox bead active. Yet the Marine paused as if listening between each murmur, his head inclined with the stillness of a man receiving report from an unseen subordinate. In an arming chamber aft of the Thunderhawk decks, Anzo found 2 tactical brothers cleaning their blades. They had already cleaned them. The weapon edges were mirror bright. Still they worked at them, scraping and wiping with ritual cloths, drawing each cloth back to inspect it for stains that were no longer there. "You have been ordered to rest," Anzo said. Neither looked up. "Rest is noisy," one replied. In a corpse processing lock where the fleet's dead enemies were catalogued before void disposal, Anzo saw something worse. A line marine stood over the body of a slain Umidian militia fighter, retained for forensic record. The corpse had been dead for 3 days. Its chest was already opened for organ inspection. The brother was cutting it apart again, methodically, reducing what remained to strips and wet heaps with his combat knife, while speaking through clenched teeth. "We followed procedure. We followed procedure. We followed procedure." Anzo gripped the Marine's wrist, hard enough to stop the blade. The battle brother jerked and turned, eyes wild, teeth bared. "They say my name," he rasped. "Whose?" "The dead." Anzo held his gaze for a long moment. Then he took the knife from him and summoned a chaplain. No deck was untouched. Armories smelled of incense and cold iron and fear. Reclusiam halls rang with penance. In the strategiums, captains spoke more sharply than before, every tactical debate carrying the edge of men trying to drown out some other conversation, audible only to themselves. Even the serfs moved differently, quicker, heads bowed lower, as though the fleet were no longer merely a vessel of war, but a reliquary full of anger. Chief Librarian Zastus Manon imposed wards across the ships as soon as he accepted that prayer alone would not master what had taken root. Hexagrammic seals were renewed on bulkheads that had not required renewal in centuries. Psychic dampers thrummed to life in chambers normally left dormant. Librarians paced the corridors in hooded procession, croziers of warding and force staves tracing signs through recycled air. Manon himself led kill teams into sensor-black dead spaces between reliquary vaults, cargo decks, and munitions crawls, where Auspex distortions suggested residual warp presence. They found anomalies often enough to vindicate him, and never enough to save them. A cargo bay 3 decks below the prow batteries was discovered sealed from the inside by no known mechanism. When breached, it contained only supply pallets and a ring of blood handprints on the ceiling far above any man's reach. In a maintenance artery running beside the plasma ducts, a servitor was found ripped open, not by a blade, but by pressure from within, its augmetic eyes still recording static-laced images of avian silhouettes passing in the dark. One of Manon's librarians tracked a shimmer through the machine chapel of the starboard lance batteries and unleashed a burst of psychic force. So violent, it cracked shrine glass and stunned 3 servitors. When the afterimage cleared, there was nothing there save the smell of wet feathers and hot copper. Manon emerged from each search harder and stranger. He was still precise in speech, still formal, still every inch the stern keeper of the chapter's occult disciplines. Yet there was a new delay in him, a fractional pause before response, as if he were listening to a second voice and deciding which words belonged to his own tongue. His eyes sometimes fixed on empty air, a heartbeat too long. Once, in council, he finished Captain Braglin's sentence before the man had fully spoken it, then seemed momentarily surprised by what he himself had said. No one named it. Not yet. But many noticed. Captain Eli Zartan noticed most of all. He came to Crannon in the Strategium, while the fleet still held to the route that should have taken them back towards censure and reckoning. Hololithic stars glowed between them. Red threat. Sigils pulsed where Umidia and Demetra lay, within the same poisoned system spread. Crannon stood at the center of the light like a judge within a tribunal fire. Zartan saluted. "My lord." Crannon turned. "Speak." "The chapter degrades by the hour. Brothers cannot rest. Chaplains restore nothing. Apothecaries find no flaw because the wound is not in flesh. We should halt. We should return and submit account before this worsens." Crannon's stare held no warmth. "Submit account to whom?" "To the Imperium we still serve." "We served at Umidia." Zartan's jaw tightened. "We murdered at Umidia." The word hung between them like a drawn blade. Crannon stepped down from the dais until he stood close enough that even another Astartes would feel the threat of him. "Measure your speech, Captain." "I do measure it." Zartan did not retreat. "That is why I choose it." For a moment the only sound in the chamber was the low, mechanical hymn of the Strategium engines and the muffled pounding of distant macro-battery cycling. Crannon spoke at last, every syllable cut clean. "Doubt is the true heresy. It enters before corruption does. It loosens the grip. It weakens the strike. We followed correct procedure in the presence of taint. The warp was present. The deception was real. If the stain spread from Umidia, then it spread along known channels. Demetra lies nearest. Sister world. Sister traffic. Sister contagion." Zartan answered, more quietly now, but no less hard. "Or sister innocence." Crannon's eyes flashed then, not with madness, but with something perhaps more dangerous, a wrath anchored to conviction. "If contamination exists there, it proves our cause was righteous. If it does not, then we shall know the scale of the deception. Either way, we do not crawl back under accusation with empty hands." "Then you seek evidence by force." "I seek truth by fire," Crannon said. "That is how truth is often uncovered in this age." Zartan looked at him for a long time. "You are not seeking truth, Lord. You are seeking absolution." Crannon's voice became colder still. You forget yourself. No. Zartan saluted again, the gesture iron rigid. I remember exactly what I am. He turned and left. Crannan watched him go without recalling him, but when the doors shut, the chapter master's hands had become fists. Elsewhere, the pressure mounted. Brothers snapped at one another over munitions audits and fire lane calculations, with a ferocity once reserved for foes. Formal address remained, rank held, ritual held, but strain bled through every exchange. We followed procedure. Then why do the dead know our names? That is weakness speaking. No, weakness is pretending not to hear them. You shame the chapter. The chapter is already shamed. Anzo heard one such exchange in a weapons corridor outside the scout lockers and kept walking, though the words followed him for a long while after. He had begun to feel it too by then. Not voices yet, not clearly, but the sense that someone paced a half step behind him at all times. When he paused, it paused. When he turned, there was only corridor, lumen haze, brass-rimmed deck plating, and his own reflection in armor glass. He asked for redeployment twice in one watch cycle. So did many others. Combat had become rumor within the chapter, spoken of now not with hunger for glory, but with the desperate pragmatism of medicine. During drills, the whispers dulled. During live fire exercises, they thinned. A Marine who buried a combat blade into a target hard enough, fast enough, could almost imagine quiet returning. Crannan saw the same pattern and made of it doctrine. The command was issued fleet-wide with no flourish, only encoded order runes, and the chapter master's own voice transmitted into every helm, chapel, strategium, and berth. Course correction. We do not return. Set heading for Demetra. Full battle readiness. Apothecarian and librarium assessments will continue en route. We go not in retreat, nor in penance, but in confirmation. If Belethu corruption extends beyond Umidia, then proof will be found and excised. The chapter remains in compliance with its sacred duty. No one cheered. No one objected on open vox. But throughout the fleet, men who had once received orders as unquestioned law now stood in silence and listened to the things speaking beneath the words. The ships rolled toward translation. At the final rite before the jump, chaplains blessed the Geller fields and struck their crozius heads against the deck until the echoes rang like funeral bells. Navigators sealed themselves in warded sanctums. Servitors locked down outer compartments. Red battle lights took the place of the usual lumen glow. The fleet became a chain of iron cathedrals, bracing for passage through nightmare. When the drives bit and reality opened, every corridor seemed to exhale. The warp washed against the hulls like black surf under a moon no sane man could name. Geller fields hummed. Bulkheads sweated chill moisture. On the lower decks, whispers gathered in corners where no speakers were mounted and no mouths were visible. Men heard prayers spoken in voices they had put to death. Others heard weeping. Others heard only their own names, repeated with patient, intimate certainty. Anzo walked a transit causeway between launch bays and felt the whole ship around him change character. It no longer felt like a warship bearing him to righteous combat. It felt like a sepulchre moving through a greater grave. Ahead of him, beneath the red lumen wash, a battle brother stood utterly still, with his forehead resting against the adamantine wall. His lips moved soundlessly. Another knelt in an alcove shrine, helm on, bolter across his lap, listening. From somewhere far below came a single bark of laughter, cut short into a scream. The red honor sailed on through the madness between worlds, and every deck aboard her felt haunted long before Demetra's sun rose on the Auspex. Demetra died beneath a sky of orderly traffic lights and manufactorum vapors, beneath the sainted statuary of Hab spires, beneath prayer towers that had chimed the canonical hours for millennia, beneath all the patient machinery of an imperial world that had not yet understood it had been condemned. There was no careful descent, no measured reconnaissance web cast over suspected districts. No patient distinction between shrine quarter and labor quarter, between void port and grain relay, between militia redoubt and civilian thoroughfare. The Crimson Sabres came to Demetra already half lost, their thoughts ragged by whispers, their trance rest broken into nightmares, their every doctrine curdled by the need to prove that Umidia had been no crime but necessity. What had once been precision remained precision still, but it was the precision of a descending guillotine. Targeting arrays filled the strategium vaults of the Red Honor in layered red runes. Population centers, void ports, agri-holds, refinery towns, shrine districts, water relays, transit nexuses, vox spires, civic archives, barracks, basilicas, all were assigned assault vectors in a single synchronized scheme of annihilation so mathematically elegant that it resembled a campaign plan from the pages of the Codex itself until one understood what it truly sought to achieve. Crannon stood at the center of the hololithic storm and gave the order to commence. No rhetoric followed, no blessing of the righteous, no invocation of glory, only a sequence of command bursts as cold as cogitator logic. Primary compliance denied by probable contamination spread. Urban ingress in spearhead tiers. Population movement to be treated as vector breach. Sanctified sites are not exempt from correction. Purge by district until the disease no longer presence. He spoke the war into being like a magistrate reading sentence. Thunderhawks plunged through the upper cloud strata in crimson wedges. Their engines rolled over Demetra's cities like the first thunder of the end. Drop pods followed them, hammering into precinct squares, transit plazas, and shrine approaches with enough force to break ferrocrete and toss men into the air in bloody spinning fragments. Orbiting gunships lanced anti-air towers and vox dishes in the same breath. The first minutes of the invasion severed the world's voice from its own body. Communication died, then cohesion died with it. Umidia had been a green nightmare of rain and masks and hidden fires. Demetra was worse for being so recognizably human. Its streets were paved and named. Its shrines had saint rolls and donation ledgers. Its hab corridors smelled of recycled water, cooked starch, sweat, and machine oil. It was a world of shift horns and prayer queues, of freight convoys and tithe records, of men hurrying to work under the gaze of imperial statuary. That was what made the slaughter obscene. Every shell burst, every bolter detonation, every roaring chain blade found not a jungle phantom, but something ordinary and imperial and defenseless beneath it. In the hab districts of Carthan Reach, tactical squads advanced through corridor mazes where lumen strips flickered and families huddled against locked doors. Breach charges blew portals inward. Bolter rounds entered rooms a heartbeat later. Walls vanished under detonations of flesh and plaster. Fathers trying to shield sons were reduced to spinning gobbets of ribs and steaming organ meat. Mothers and daughters were absent because the tale had no need of them, but old men, laborers, temple custodians, and militia youths filled the apartments and died in their place, hurled apart by mass reactive wrath, while sacred household icons toppled from shelves into the blood. In the shrine queue outside the Basilica of St. Vortigern, several hundred civilians had knelt awaiting entry when the first rhino columns broke through the square. Panic surged through the line. A priest tried to hold the crowd with raised aquila and amplified prayer. Vox distortion mangled the words. To the Sabers above their weapon sights, it sounded like frenzy. A Devastator sergeant opened fire. The front ranks exploded. Men came apart in wet sprays that splashed the shrine doors red. The rhino formation did not slow. Tracks rolled over fallen bodies and ground them into the stone, dragging strips of skin, robes, and shattered bone across the square in long, glistening smears. Elsewhere, the chapter moved with such harsh discipline that the massacre acquired the texture of administration. A shrine district was marked. A spearhead descended. Resistance, real or imagined, was logged. Security failure was assumed. Streets were cut off, blocks were sealed, structures were breached, occupants were judged by movement, by vox tone, by devotional cadence, by proximity to target sectors, by fear itself. If they fled, they were contamination attempting spread. If they stood and shouted loyalty, they were corrupted enough to mimic it. If militia raised weapons in blind panic, they became confirmation. There was no gesture left by which a man could prove innocence once the Crimson Sabres had determined that innocence itself was suspect. Crannan led from the front, without a tremor of uncertainty visible in his bearing. He strode through refinery precincts and shrine avenues with his command squad around him, armor lacquered in fresh blood, power sword trailing gore and ash. At each junction, he issued doctrinal observations over the battle net in a tone that never rose, never broke, never admitted what he was truly walking through. Concentration of moving bodies at intersections invites insurgent blending. Deny the intersections. Civilian clustering around sanctified architecture creates false immunity zones. Break the clusters. Local compliance cannot be trusted where ritual structures allow covert assembly. Breach the structures. Where ambiguity persists, escalation is preferable to delay. He was still trying to be lawful. That was the horror of him. He murdered with a magistrate's calm and sought to align atrocity to procedure so completely that not even his own conscience might find purchase in the seams. Manon's librarians fed the engine of it. They moved through the assault sectors, muttering ward litanies and opening themselves to the warp in controlled flares of perception. Everywhere they looked, they found what they claimed was corruption. A shrine mural wept blood. A militia bunker contained devotional script painted over older symbols of avian form. A worker barracks returned impossible thermal shadows. A plaza full of kneeling laborers seemed to Manon, for a heartbeat, to ripple as though all present wore masks of feather and skin. Contamination. Confirmed, Manon voxed more than once. Brother librarian Serevan did likewise. So did the others. Whether they spoke truth or madness no longer mattered. Their words entered the battle net, and from there entered every brother's fractured mind. Each confirmation became one more nail hammered into certainty. Each warning made the next burst of slaughter easier to justify. The chapter, already haunted, began to crave validation so desperately that any sign of taint, no matter how thin, became license. Captain Eli Zartan obeyed every order issued to him. He struck where commanded. He led breaching actions with the same remorseless competence that had made his name feared on a dozen worlds. Yet his obedience had turned poisonous inside him. He no longer looked upon the chapter and saw brothers alone. He saw thresholds crossed. His helm display held a private ledger no chaplain had authorized. Names. Brother sergeants whose kill reports showed unrequired excess. Officers whose voices had gone too calm amid civilian screams. Chaplains whose penance rites had changed from absolution to exaltation. Librarians whose eyes lingered on the dead with something like hunger. He marked them in silence while his company fought through the manufacturum districts, storing data where only he could review it. During the seizure of the Helioc Vox Tower, Zartan watched a veteran of the Second Tier apart a surrendered militia officer with bare hands after the man had thrown down his weapon and begun reciting the litany of loyal service. The Marine split the officer's jaw off, rammed him into the wall hard enough to burst vertebrae, then kept striking the corpse while whispering that it was finally quiet. Zartan logged the name and said nothing. There were too many such moments already. Anzo Riegler descended not into the main butchery lines at first, but into the civic skeleton of the world. His scouts seized data vaults, traffic cogitators and vox spires, so that the chapter could sever and reshape Demetra's response. It was there, inside the machine of planetary administration, that he saw the lie most clearly. The first archive vault he took contained emergency dispatches from precinct militia and shrine wardens. They were not the communiques of a world coordinated in apostasy. They were pleas, requests for clarification, reports of unidentified red-armored Astartes opening fire on population clusters, demands for authentication from local commanders who still believed an error had been made. One Vox recording captured a male enforcer captain shouting over gunfire that his men were loyal and would stand down if only someone would explain why the Angels of Death were burning the district. The recording ended in a burst of static and wet detonations. At another spire, Anzo intercepted local defense net traffic, so confused it became pitiful. Some sectors thought Xenos had landed. Others thought a civil war had broken out between Imperial branches. One shrine prefect transmitted a full liturgical greeting to the Crimson Sabers every 4 minutes on open broadcast, while his district died around him, as though proper etiquette might yet stop the shells. His scouts secured a traffic nexus overlooking one of the main shrine thoroughfares of Demetra Primus. From that height, Anzo watched the defenders below try and fail to become a coherent foe. PDF vehicles took wrong turns into kill zones because Vox routes had collapsed. Militia squads fired on shadows and one another. Civilians flooded across the roads carrying reliquaries and food satchels, and old men on improvised carts, only to be shredded by heavy bolters when the press of bodies crossed a quarantine line no one on the ground could even see. "This is not a rebellion," Brother Silas said quietly beside him. Anzo did not answer for several breaths. Below them, a land raider turned into a side street and flattened a transit line shelter full of kneeling laborers. The structure folded under the tank's weight with a crunch of metal and bodies. Blood jetted from beneath the treads in sudden arterial fans and then smeared into black paste as the machine rolled on. "No," Anzo said at last. "It is an execution in search of its crime." Yet still, he did not turn his weapons on his own chapter. Still, he fed targeting data upward when ordered. Still, he moved. The killing lasted until resistance had ceased to be military and become merely biological. There were no more coherent counterattacks, only scattered men in shrine robes or work overalls, or militia colors firing from windows, basements, and half-burned alleys before they too were reduced to chunks. Demetra's manufactorums burned. Its agri-holds were shelled into mulch, its chapel vaults filled with corpses waiting in prayer lines they would never leave. Smoke climbed into the atmosphere in such thickness that from orbit the planet seemed ringed by dark bruises. When at last the gun slowed, Crannan went to the strategium aboard the Red Honor and filed his justification. He did so in full formality. The report passed through servitor relays and sanctified data seals in language so controlled, so bloodlessly exact, that any reader ignorant of the dead beneath it might have mistaken it for an ordinary record of compliance action. Demetra designated at elevated contagion risk by direct proximity to Umidia contamination corridor. Initial indicators confirmed distributed doctrinal compromise. Widespread population instability and non-compliant militia response necessitated comprehensive correction. Threat judged non-containable by localized sanction. Planetary purge enacted under battlefield necessity. Contaminating vectors eliminated. Operational objective achieved. He signed it with the sigil of his office, while the blood of Demetra still dried in the joints of his gauntlets. The answer came not from exoneration, but from doom. Intercepted. Astropathic traffic was brought to Manon first, then to Cranan under full seal. The librarians had torn it from the ether before local relays could hide or erase it. It contained high Gothic warrants, inquisitorial censure, strategic advisories, and one sentence whose bureaucratic precision struck harder than any shell: excommunicate traitoris. The chapter was judged renegade. Imperial forces were authorized to open fire upon the Crimson Sabers on sight. Their name was Ash. Their heraldry was target mark. Every oath of service they had ever spoken was now answered by sanction. For a long moment, no one in the strategium said anything. Crannan read the decree in stillness. Manon watched him with hollow eyes. Zartan stood apart, as if distance might yet preserve some remnant of himself from what this moment made inevitable. Anzo, summoned from the Vox spires, saw the chapter master's jaw tighten once and only once. Then Crannan said, "Signal Drogsh." Across light years too, late already, warning sped toward the home the chapter had rebuilt from old shame. Drogsh received the Imperium not as honored guardian, but as condemned stain. An imperial fleet, translated above the world before any full explanation could spread among the serf castes or moon installations. Inquisitorial black ships moved with them. Stormtroops and naval armsmen made planetfall under the sign of legal purity. Warrants were read. Access codes were overridden. Fortress redoubts were isolated. The human dependents of the Crimson Sabers, armor serfs, labor thralls, hereditary household lines and sworn auxilia, were rounded up where they could be and shot where they stood when speed made process inconvenient. The old moon bases of Rogun's dead system remnant were searched and purged alike. Captain Murdoch of the 10th had remained on Drogsh with half-trained scouts and watch cadres, while the chapter answered Umidia's call. He saw the first kill orders blossom across local channels and understood enough at once. There would be no hearing, no appeal, no distinction between servant and gene-son. The Imperium had already judged all blood linked to the chapter unclean. He gathered what scouts he could. Some were barely more than armed aspirants. Some had not yet seen their first true war. They fled through maintenance vaults and forgotten launch galleries, while above them, the monastery world that had sheltered the chapter for centuries was seized room by room. Murdoch did not try to hold it. He knew an impossible battle when he saw one. He cut a path to a hidden craft, killed 2 armsmen, 3 stormtroopers, and 1 weeping serf, who begged to come with them when there was no room left, and escaped Drogsh beneath fire.
Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Support really helps.
Behind him, the world of the Crimson Sabers was erased by legal decree and righteous guns. Aboard the Red Honor, Crannan assembled what remained of his chapter in the great mustering hall. They came in ranks beneath guttering lumen globes and hanging banners blackened by old campaigns. Their armor was scarred, blood-crusted, smoke-dark. Some stood too rigid, as if holding themselves together by will alone. Others moved with the tiny hesitations of men, listening to another voice beneath every sound. Crannan stood above them upon the iron dais. No honor guards flanked him now. No triumph icons burned. He looked not like a conqueror, but like the statue of one dragged through a charnel pit and left upright by sheer hatred. "The Imperium has rendered judgment," he said. His voice rolled through the chamber, hard and clear, and carrying over the faint machine hymn of the ship. "We are named traitors. We are denied sanctuary. Our homeworld is doomed. Our dead are unburied. Our brothers beyond this fleet will be hunted and put to the sword, if they have not already fallen." A shiver passed through the gathered ranks, not outwardly visible, but there in the scrape of ceramite, in the hardening of stances, in the silence becoming something heavier. Crannan continued, "I say this to you now. We are not absolved by surrender, for surrender will grant us only the execution reserved for beasts. We are not restored by return, for there is no return. We are still the Emperor's warriors, whether Terra names us so or not. The enemies of mankind remain in their billions. Witches, mutants, abhumans, renegades, the hell-spawned filth of the eye." He paused, and for the first time the whispering in the hall seemed to draw back, as if even the dead wished to hear what sentence he would pass upon the living. "If the Imperium has damned us, then we shall seek redemption where no innocent need die by our hand. We will go into the Eye of Terror. There we shall kill until we are spent. There we shall spend every drop of our blood against the foes of mankind. No plea, no retreat, no hope of pardon, only battle until the last saber falls. No cheer answered him, but helms bowed, fists struck, breastplates, some from conviction, some from despair, some because there was nothing else left in the galaxy for them to be. The Red Honor turned its prow toward the mouth of damnation, and the broken chapter prepared to seek a noble death in hell. The threshold to the Eye of Terror burned with war long before the Crimson Sabers reached it. Void stations ringed the ragged edge of real space like iron thorns driven into the hide of the abyss. Watch fortresses of the Imperial Navy floated among minefields and orbital reliquaries, their gun decks bright with reactor heat, their auger dishes turned toward the wound in creation where light itself seemed to hesitate. Around them drifted the warships of a blockade old as dynastic memory, line cruisers, escort flotillas, cathedral-proud battleships with rows of lance emitters glowing like the candles of execution altars. They stood sentinel against the dark, not because the dark could be truly denied, but because denial was the only language the Imperium had ever spoken to horror. When the Red Honor and her companions came on attack vector, the blockade answered with fire before challenge. Lances crossed the black between them in lines of white wrath. Macro shells the size of chapel columns thundered from broadsides and turned emptiness into storms of shrapnel and incandescence. One escort of the Crimson Sabers vanished almost at once, its prow sheared away by a concentrated lance strike, its atmosphere venting in a glittering torrent of bodies, parchment and burning relic shards. Another ship caught a spread of torpedoes across the starboard quarter and split down the middle, halves peeling apart like butchered fruit, decks exposed to the void as men and servitors and ammunition magazines whirled out together into silent annihilation. The Red Honor drove through it all. Her hull was a fortress in crimson and white, her flanks plated with ancient honor script and kill markings older than the memories of men, her macro batteries answering the Imperial broadside with such disciplined fury that the dark flashed red around her. The battle barge did not weave. It did not seek safety. It advanced with the pitiless linear purpose of a thing that had at last found a direction simple enough to obey. Cranon stood on the command deck beneath the cold lumen wash of battle readiness, helm sealed, cloak hanging heavy from his shoulders, one gauntleted fist resting on the pommel of his sword. Around him, bridge serfs bled from the ears as Vox traffic screamed across the command channels. Servitors sparked and twitched at their stations. Officers called ranges, bearings, kill confirmations and damage assessments in flat voices trained to endure disaster without tone. An incoming hail reached them from the Imperial flagship, formal code strings wrapped around threat seals and execution authority. Renegade Astartes vessel, Red Honor. Power down and prepare for sanction. In the name of the throne, submit to purification. Cranon looked at the Vox officer. No reply. Then he keyed the chapter-wide command channel. No more innocence, he said. His voice rolled into every helm and chapel and gunnery station aboard the fleet, into the ears of line brothers, strapped into boarding torpedoes and gun crews, chanting loading rites over sweating shell casings. Only traitors, only witches, only the damned. The vow sounded noble because it was shaped from all the right stones. It named no empire of the self. It asked for no pleasure. It clothed itself in martyrdom and corrective wrath. It was the sort of sentence that might have been carved above a fortress gate and honored for 1,000 years. That was why it was so dangerous. The blockade met them with the zeal reserved for monsters. It was not enough. Crimson Sabers' strike craft ripped through the defensive screen in murderous waves. Boarding torpedoes slammed into an Imperial cruiser's port flank and burst, vomiting Terminators and veteran breachers into smoke-clogged companionways where the defenders still believed they were fighting traitors, and so were correct, though not in the way they thought. Assault cannons turned naval armsmen into red ruin. Power fists punched through blast doors and torsos alike. Chain blades howled through press-ganged voidsmen and officer cadres in command sanctums red with emergency light. Along the main gun decks, armsmen died trying to reload batteries already aflame. A senior captain of the Navy raised his sidearm and pronounced sentence in the Emperor's name before Brother Halvek tore his head apart with a point-blank bolt round that scattered teeth and brain matter across the command throne. Elsewhere in the battle, the Red Honor drove its prow through a destroyer that had lost motive control. Armor folded, hulls shrieked. The smaller vessel crumpled under the impact and broke away in spinning sections, each one venting fire and shredded men into the abyss. Imperial stations struck back with lance beams that peeled armor from the battle barge in incandescent sheets. Decks depressurized, fires spread, damage alarms tolled like funeral bells. Still, the fleet of the damned went on, battering a path through the faithful guardians of the threshold they were about to violate. When the surviving ships crossed from the last ordered dark of Imperial space into the bruised unreality beyond, the eyes seemed to open around them like a pupil dilating in hunger. None aboard the Crimson Sabers named what they had become. They still spoke of duty. They still called the foes ahead enemies of mankind, infestations, apostates, Xenos-tainted degenerates, warp-bred filth. They entered the hell beyond the veil, not as worshippers, but as men condemned, determined to throw their lives away in useful directions. That they had already crossed a boundary deeper than location did not yet occur to many of them. They had not come to kneel. They had come to kill and be killed, and somewhere within that hard simplicity, each still hoped some final accounting might yet be balanced. It began at once. The first world they struck had no stable name. Its surface rewrote cartography by the hour. Trenches opened where plains had stood. Mountains bled cinders into seas that turned to mirror-black mud before orbit changed. Yet there was war upon it of a scale worthy even of that region's madness. Untold millions of mutant soldiery and renegade militia were locked in battle across continent-spanning trench labyrinths. Traitor armor columns moved between fortress lines built from ship hulls, basilica bones, and petrified demon growths. Above them, black fortresses traded fire with orbiting hulks in a sky veined by warp storms. Into that apocalyptic sprawl came the Crimson Sabers, like a spear cast by a dying god. Thunderhawks descended through curtains of ash and burning snow. Drop pods hammered into trench zones already drowning in artillery dead. Land raiders burst from the dust and drove through parapets made of fused bonecrete and old corpses. Dreadnoughts strode into shellfire with plasma and flame, their sarcophagi carrying heroes too ancient and wrathful to distinguish one damned world from another, so long as there were enemies still standing on it. Ahead of them stretched enemy lines so dense that the chapter's entire strength amounted to only a sliver in the broader war, a precise cutting edge inside a battle vast enough to swallow planets. Anzo Riegler landed with the 10th in the corpse trenches north of a ruined citadel city whose walls had been grown from black stone and human remains. The ground trembled under constant bombardment. Mud sucked at boots, except it was not mud alone. It was soil, ash, pulverized masonry, liquefied fat, old blood, and the dissolved remnants of countless bodies kneaded together by artillery and time. Everywhere there were dead, mutants with lamprey mouths and vestigial claws, human soldiers in patchwork armor, Astartes corpses in traitor colors, half buried in the trench lips, beast things hanging from barbed wire like butchered livestock. The air was poison thick with propellant, rot, and the copper stink of fresh slaughter. The enemy came on in tides. Mutant infantry poured over the berms, screaming with too many tongues. Heavy weapons nests opened from bunker mouths, rhymed in fleshy growth. Renegade marines in corroded plate countercharged through shell bursts, icons rattling from their armor, mouths chanting blasphemies through grilled teeth. Behind them loomed a city full of gun towers, sacrificial pits and manufactories belching smoke into a sky where shapes moved that no one looked at directly for long. The Crimson Sabres met it with perfect, disciplined violence. Bolters barked in measured patterns, each burst a knot of wet detonations in the enemy mass. Mutants burst like rotten sacks, showering the trench walls with chunks of bone and purple meat. Chainswords chewed through spine and rib, and the stringy knots of extra limbs alike. Flamers rolled sheets of alchemical fire down communication ditches, turning packed defenders into shrieking torches that stumbled and collapsed into heaps of burning fat. Devastators locked firing lanes and cut the open ground to ribbons. Veterans of the First boarded a renegade transport crawler and butchered everyone inside, leaving only blood mist venting from the firing slits. And as the battle closed around them, the voices stopped, not lessened, not drowned beneath the larger noise. Stopped. Brother Halvek noticed it first and laughed once in astonishment before driving his chainsword through the face of a mutant officer. Sergeant Vortan felt it in the middle of a bayonet crush against the trench lip and froze for a fatal fraction of a second, not from fear, but from relief so intense it was almost pain. Even Anzo, who had borne the pressure like a hand just behind the skull, felt the absence hit him like sudden clean air after weeks in a charnel pit. Silence, no accusations, no pleading, no names murmured by dead tongues, only battle, pure and immediate and red. The realization moved through the chapter faster than any order could have done. A Marine firing from a ruined parapet understood it. A chaplain knee-deep in the viscera of flensed mutants understood it. Cranon understood it as he cut down a renegade champion whose horned helm broke open under his sword to spill steaming brains and black blood over the trench boards. In battle, they were free. It should have horrified them. It did, in some hidden chamber of conscience not yet fully sealed. But horror was weaker than relief, and relief in that place became something close to ecstasy. The dead retreated while bolters spoke. The whispers fell away beneath the hot work of butchery. For the first time since Umidia, brothers could think in single lines again. Their movements sharpened. Their focus became sublime. They killed not merely because it was their duty, but because the killing granted them back themselves. That was the true damnation. The campaign on the nameless world lasted for months, perhaps longer. Time in that region was a wounded thing. The Crimson Sabres hurled themselves from one engagement to the next with a zeal that began as martyrdom and became appetite. They volunteered for the hardest breaches. They requested boarding actions against plague-ridden cruisers and demon-haunted bastions. They advanced beyond supply projection and held impossible lines because the moment they were withdrawn and the guns went still, the whispers came back. So they kept the guns speaking. They boarded a renegade grand cruiser in the midst of a void storm and fought through decks carpeted in skin and machine tendrils, while the ship's mortal crew wailed hymns to things behind the stars. They exterminated a mutant hive city by advancing room to room through towers packed so tightly with flesh that every bolter round tore through 3 bodies before detonating. They broke the outer fortress lines of a traitor Astartes citadel, where the walls were mortared with skulls, and the defenders laughed through split tongues as they died. At each victory, no triumph followed, only an urgent scanning of the horizon for the next necessary kill. The chaplains adapted faster than any would later admit. In sermons delivered in shell craters and shattered chapels, they began to speak of combat not only as duty, but as cleansing burden. Each engagement was penance. Each kill was a bead counted on the rosary of their damnation. To die in the act was noble. To live in order to continue the act was, increasingly, called necessary. Captains repeated the same logic in harder words. Martyrdom was still their stated purpose, but no one rushed stupidity for its own sake. Waste meant fewer blades to cast against the enemies of mankind. Preservation of force became a virtue because preservation meant more battle, and more battle meant more silence. Among line brothers, the change was uglier and more honest. Kill tallies were spoken over armor fastening, as once prayer cycles had been. 42 this watch, 19 in the breach, 3 traitor Astartes, 7 score mutants, 1 witch. The numbers were not boast, they were liturgical. Each counted death was proof that quiet had been purchased for another few moments. Zartan watched it happen, with a tightening sickness he refused to name. He fought as savagely as any of them. He led charges through trench mazes full of demon echoes. He held a breach line against berserkers in red brass armor, until the boards beneath him were slick enough with blood that bodies slid rather than fell. He took wounds and ignored them. He killed and killed and killed, but he kept count of different things. How quickly brothers pressed for the next engagement. How some now stood in the aftermath of battle with heads tilted, waiting not for orders, but for the return of whispers, like addicts bracing for withdrawal. How chaplains spoke more readily of righteous killing than righteous restraint. He came to Cranon after the sack of the fortress city, called Serric Vale, where the Sabers had spent 3 days breaking through traitor bastions and another 2 cleansing the underhives beneath them. The city was theirs. Its defenders lay in heaps across plazas and firing steps, armor blackened, limbs scattered, blood running from drainage channels in red-black streams. From the high wall of the command bastion, they could see the broader war still raging beyond, millions fighting and dying under an impossible sky. Cranon stood bareheaded at the parapet, face streaked with smoke and drying gore. Zartan came to his side and did not salute. "We are no longer fighting because it is right," he said. Cranon did not look at him. "We are fighting because it is necessary. We are fighting because it buys silence." The word struck more truly than any accusation yet laid. Cranon's jaw hardened. Silence allows discipline. Discipline allows continuation of duty. There is no contradiction. There is corruption in it. There is survival in it. Zartan turned toward him fully. "Hear yourself." At last, Cranon looked back. His eyes were bloodshot, not from weakness, but from sleeplessness pushed beyond even Astartes' thresholds. "I hear the dead whenever battle ceases," he said. "So do you. So do they all. If battle grants respite, then battle is our road. Would you have us lay down our weapons and let the voices devour us in prayer chambers? I would have us remember why we draw them." Cranon stepped closer. "Do not lecture me on memory. I remember Rogon. I remember Drogsh. I remember Umidia. I remember Demetra. I remember every world that failed and every world we failed upon. What remains to us, if not this?" Zartan answered in a low growl. "Judgment." Cranon's expression changed then, not to fury alone, but to hatred sharpened by recognition. He had heard the truth and despised the one who carried it. "What remains to us," the chapter master said, "is war." He turned away, and the interview was ended. The signs of further decay came slowly, then all at once. No one spoke of them openly. No one used the forbidden word. Yet they were there in armor-fit rooms and medici chambers, and the sidelong glances of serfs, too frightened to speak. A battle brother removed his gauntlet, and found the fingernails beneath had thickened into black talons before returning to normal by the next watch. Another developed a second row of teeth that vanished after a week, leaving his gums torn and bleeding. Manon's librarian suffered nosebleeds of black, glittering blood after prolonged warding rites. One veteran claimed the aquila embossed on his breastplate had changed shape in his sight alone, its wings narrowing into something more avian each time the whispers rose. Apothecaries recorded unexplained lesions that healed into script-like scarification. Helm displays glitched with symbols no machine spirit should generate. More than one brother awoke from rest with dried blood at the ears and no recollection of what he had heard in trance. Still none said the word. They called it stress, contamination residue, warp abrasion, battle exposure. They were loyalists still, and loyalists did not become the thing they hunted merely by stepping where it dwelt. That belief remained, even as the edges of it began to rot. By the end of that first great cycle of war, the Crimson Sabres were bloodied almost beyond recognition, companies reduced, armor scarred and patched with enemy plate, ammunition stores run lean, dreadnoughts damaged, librarians hollow-eyed, chaplains harsher than ever. The dead within the chapter were many. The dead outside it were beyond counting, yet they still lived. That was the revelation that came to Cranon like a stab between the ribs. He stood in the silence after another victory, aboard the Red Honor, while decks were scrubbed of blood and void fire damage reports crawled across the strategium walls. Around him, the ship sounded like a wounded beast. Somewhere far below, he could already hear the whispers beginning to return as the last guns cooled. He had sworn to seek a noble end. He had led his chapter into the eye to die profitably, gloriously if possible, anonymously if not. But the chapter had not died. It had adapted. It had found a rhythm in slaughter. It had become effective in damnation. Worse, some part of him, hidden and raw and terrible, recoiled not from that fact, but from the thought of losing it. He no longer wanted a clean death. He wanted another campaign, another breach, another world of enemies whose screams could drown the dead, another span of hours without accusation. He wanted survival. When he understood that, he closed his eyes in horror. When he opened them again, the horror was still there. So was the desire. The summons went out through the wounded fleet without drum, without hymn, without any of the solemn pageantry that had once wrapped the will of the chapter master in dignity. It was only an order. All surviving officers, all sergeants, all brothers fit to stand in armor, muster in the grand hall aboard the Red Honor. They came beneath dim red lumens, and the smell of machine oil, blood and incense burned too long in stale air. The hall had once displayed banners from victories won in the Emperor's name, campaign rolls illuminated in gold, reliquaries set into alcoves of white stone and brass. Now the banners were smoke-black and patched. Several reliquary niches stood empty, where battle damage or hurried stripping had claimed their contents. The deck plating still bore the weld scars of repair from the blockade action at the threshold. Even the statues of ancient chapter worthies along the side aisles seemed diminished beneath the low light, their noble faces half lost behind soot. The survivors formed in ordered ranks out of instinct deeper than thought. White shoulder guards scarred and dirtied, crimson plate patched with scavenged ceramite from enemies now dead, purity seals browned by void heat, oaths of moment hanging in tatters. Their discipline remained, but it was the discipline of men holding a wall already cracked through. Anzo Riegler stood with the remnants of the 10th and watched the hall fill by companies broken down to cadres, and cadres broken down to war bands. Too many helms turned by slight degrees, as though their wearers listened to murmurings in the spaces between engine thrum and breath scratch. Too many warriors stood with their fists clenched before any word had been spoken. He felt it in his own skull as well, that constant pressure just behind the eyes, the dead shifting and whispering in the hollows of thought, waiting for silence to deepen enough that they might be heard more clearly. Captain Eli Zartan stood near the front, with the survivors of the 4th around him, broad and immovable, helm maglocked to his hip. He looked like a fortress carved into human shape. His face had grown leaner over the long campaigns within the eye. Fresh scars crossed old ones. His eyes had not softened. If anything, they had become more exact, as though every compromise made by the chapter had honed him to a harder edge rather than worn him down. Manon stood to one side of Cranon's dais, robed over armor, psychic hood dormant, but not asleep. He seemed paler than any living man had a right to be. The shadows under his eyes had deepened into bruised hollows. New sigils had been worked into the hem of his robes in silver wire and blood-dark thread, patterns no one had seen him wear in the old days of Rogon's memory or Drogsh's stern purity. Talismans hung at his belt with the weight of hidden meanings. No one remarked upon them. Too much had already gone unnamed. At last Cranon mounted the dais. The murmuring in the hall died. He stood beneath the chapter standard, and for a heartbeat, Anzo saw what the man had once been able to inspire with nothing but his presence. Sevastus Cranon had always possessed the brutal gift of certainty. Even now, even ruined by war and sleeplessness and the grinding pressure of the dead, he radiated command like heat from a furnace. His armor had been repainted, yet not perfectly. Beneath the fresh crimson, beneath the repaired lacquer and resealed edges, there lingered black scoring from 100 close fights and the faint stains of blood that no armor serf's work could fully remove. When he spoke, he did not waste a word. "The Imperium is dead to us." The sentence landed harder than any shell. No movement followed it. The hall seemed to lock around the words. Anzo felt his secondary heart give one heavy beat against his ribs. Somewhere farther back in the ranks, Ceramite creaked as a brother's hands tightened on his bolter. Cranon continued, "Martyrdom is a lie. We came into this place to seek a noble end. We have found only protracted war and the knowledge that death does not cleanse failure. It only leaves the survivors to carry it." His gaze moved over the assembled chapter with unblinking severity. "Shame is a luxury for men who still possess a home to crawl back to. We do not. Judgment has already been rendered. Our names are ash on imperial lips. The dead within our skulls do not lessen because we condemn ourselves more eloquently than our enemies have done. Therefore, I say this plainly. Survival must come before shame. Endurance must come before memory. We will live, because only the living can still kill the foes of mankind." There were brothers who flinched at that, though only inwardly. Others seemed to sag by a fraction, as if a hidden burden had been acknowledged at last. A few, Anzo saw with cold clarity, straightened, because the thing they had feared to name had now been spoken aloud by their lord and made lawful. Zartan stepped forward before anyone else could answer. "No." The word struck the silence with such force that several helms turned at once. Cranon's stare fixed upon him. "You stand in assembly, Captain. Mind the form of your reply." Zartan did not bow. "No, my lord," he said again, more formally now, but with no less iron in it. "The Imperium may have cast us out. It may hunt us. It may deny us name, fortress, and grave. Yet if we declare it dead to us, then we become what it accused us of being." A ripple moved through the ranks. Not disorder, recognition. "We remain what we have always been," Cranon said. "Warriors abandoned by lesser men and still set upon holy duty." Zartan answered at once. "Then speak of duty, speak of discipline, speak of penance if you must, but do not speak as though survival alone were virtue. That road has no end worth reaching." Cranon descended one step from the dais. "Would you rather perish cleanly and leave the voices unsilenced forever? I would rather die a loyal son than live long enough to forget what the word means." Manon's eyes half closed at that, and Anzo saw one of the librarians near the rear stiffen as if stung. Around the chamber, tension thickened like promethium vapor waiting on a spark. Cranon's voice grew softer. That only made it more dangerous. "You still think this is a matter of words, Eli? Loyalty is not recitation. It is function. It is continuance of useful violence in the Emperor's cause. The Imperium has no claim upon our obedience if it seeks our extinction instead of our service." "It has every claim," Zartan snapped, "because it is the Imperium." Now the hall truly shifted, not in open defiance, in the terrible collective awareness that the last dividing line had at last been reached. Brothers who had endured Umidia, Demetra, exile, and hell itself now stood upon the edge of a choice no codex diagram had ever prepared them to make. Live as damned men under the authority of a master who no longer believed return or sacrifice had meaning, or die preserving a conception of duty that might already belong to ghosts. Anzo felt himself caught between those poles so sharply it was almost physical pain. Crannan was his chapter master. That truth sat in bone and gene seed. Zartan was not wrong. That truth sat there too, and beneath both truths moved the lower, filthier certainty that when the fleet guns fell silent and the battles ended, the whispers returned, intimate and patient and unbearable, until only fresh blood brought respite. Manon stepped forward then, and his intervention felt like cold oil poured onto a fire. "The captain speaks from an admirable but outdated conception of purity," he said. "We move through altered circumstances. Old forms do not suffice. There are wards yet untried, relic disciplines adapted from recovered sources, interpretive schemas through which the pressure upon our minds may be redirected, contained, perhaps even mastered." Zartan turned on him. "Mastered by what?" "By necessity," Manon replied. The word should have been nothing. In his mouth it became a stain. Zartan's lip curled. "You dress corruption in tactical language. I dress survival in language you can endure hearing." The captains nearest them shifted stance. Chaplains lowered their crozius heads by fractions. Anzo knew then that the fracture would not be debated away. It had already gone too deep for counsel. Too much blood, too many silences purchased by battle, too many unnamed rights and private deviations had passed unchallenged. Now each side could at last see the other clearly. Crannan lifted one gauntleted hand. "Enough. The matter is decided. Those who cannot accept it will obey until their doubts are corrected by service." Zartan's reply came with grim finality. "No, they will not." The first shot came from neither of them. Brother Vortan of the 7th turned his bolter upon one of Zartan's lieutenants, perhaps because he had already chosen his side, perhaps because he feared Zartan's refusal would unravel the whole hall if left unanswered. The round hit at speaking distance. The lieutenant's chest exploded, ribs and both hearts erupting through his back in a red-black sheet that spattered 3 nearby brothers and the deck behind them. For half a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the chamber became murder. Bolters detonated in enclosed air with deafening force. Muzzle flashes strobed across the standards and statues. A chaplain bellowed a catechism of obedience and brought his crozius down on a sergeant's helm, crushing it into the skull beneath in a wet metallic ruin. Brothers of the 4th fired back point-blank into the ranks of the 7th, mass reactive shells blowing shoulders apart and punching men off their feet in clouds of shattered ceramite and hot organs. The first line collapsed into a close-quarters slaughter, too intimate for any battlefield grandeur. Boarding corridor warfare without the corridor, chamber purges without foreign enemy, bolter detonations at arm's length, chain blades igniting almost face to face. Anzo threw himself aside as a burst stitched through the ranks where he had stood. Brother Silas slammed into him, dragged him behind a cracked marble plinth, and fired over it into the melee. A veteran of the 1st leapt the dais steps with a roaring chain axe and buried it in the shoulder of a 4th Company sergeant, chewing down through collar, lung, and half the ribcage before the dying Marine rammed a combat knife through his throat seal. All around them, warriors recited duty as they butchered one another. By gene and oath, submit. In the Emperor's name, stand down. Correction authorized. You are the deviation. Obedience unto death. The words had become execution formulas. Crannan drew his sword and cut a path through the knot of bodies surging toward the dais. He moved with merciless economy, not raging, not pleading, simply killing every brother who placed himself between command and obedience. One Marine fired on him and lost both arms at the elbow in the next heartbeat. Another charged with chain blade raised and was split from shoulder to breastbone, his open torso spilling loops of intestine and shattered spine over the steps. Zartan met him only once amid that first eruption. Power sword struck power sword in a crack of white force that lit the hall like lightning. They locked for a breath, face to face, helm grills almost touching. "You would damn them all," Zartan growled. "I would preserve what can still fight," Cranon answered. Then a bolter round took one of Zartan's guard in the head, and the duel broke apart in the crush. Manon's hand rose, fingers spread in psychic invocation. Invisible force hurled a cluster of 4th Company brothers backward, hard enough to burst armor seals and crack spines against the wall. One tried to rise with blood streaming from his eye lenses. Another crawled 3 paces before Brother Halvek stepped in and ended him with a bolt through the back of the skull. Yet Manon's power was not clean. Witch light crawled over his gauntlet in colors Anzo did not wish to name. The wards hanging from his belt rattled like teeth. One of the librarians beside him bled black from the nose and laughed once before choking it back down. The killings spread out of the grand hall into adjoining passages, armories, and muster antechambers. Chamber by chamber, deck by deck, the schism took the form Astartes civil bloodshed always must, brief, concentrated, and catastrophic. No running battles of frightened men, only sudden eruptions of precise annihilation. A squad trying to secure a corridor was met by another squad advancing under the same icon, and neither side lowered weapons quickly enough. A blast door sealed. Breach charges answered. Brothers died in the opening gap before the smoke had cleared. Execution duels flared inside chapels where former comrades met under Saint Lamps and settled doctrine with blade and pistol. Anzo fought through it in fragments, never certain whether he was preserving life or merely postponing death. Twice he pulled brothers of the 10th out of kill zones. Once he put a bolt round through the helm of a raging veteran who had already eviscerated one scout and was dragging another toward a chain blade with prayers pouring from his grill. At one junction, he found himself covering Zartan's retreat without consciously deciding to do so, his carbine barking at pursuers while the captain gathered survivors around him. Zartan saw him and held his gaze for a single beat. "You know what this is," the captain said. Anzo answered with difficulty. "I know it is too late." "No." Zartan's face was streaked with blood, not all his own. "It is only too late if no one leaves." He turned, bellowed orders, and the broken remnants of the 4th began to withdraw in disciplined fighting retreat toward the launch decks and secondary docking arms. Others joined them. Not enough to shatter Cranon's authority entirely, but enough to prove the chapter had been sundered below any hope of repair. Brothers who still believed damnation need not be embraced chose movement over debate. Those who remained with Cranon chose survival, power, or simple refusal to abandon the only structure left. The pride of Rogon broke docking clamps under fire. She had once borne the memory of their first homeworld in her name like a relic. Now she became the ark of those who would not surrender that memory to necessity. Through launch bay smoke and warning klaxons, under sporadic macro fire from ships still uncertain where their loyalties lay, Zartan led much of the 4th aboard her and sealed the void gates behind them. Blood marked the embarkation deck in handprints, boot tracks, and the slick remains of brothers who had almost made the ramp. Cranon reached the primary observation gallery in time to see the cruiser pulling away, engines flaring against the void. Battle damage mottled her hull. Several weapon batteries were dead. Her heraldry was scorched, yet she still moved with purpose. Zartan appeared on a magnified bridge pict on the command hololith. Vox Link forced open for a final exchange. His face was stone. "If we meet again," he said, "it will be as foes." Cranon stared back. Every scrap of old fraternity burned out of his gaze. "Then come armed." The transmission died. The pride of Rogon turned into the bruised dark and was gone. Silence did not follow. Not true silence. The dead rushed in to occupy the absence left by gunfire. Whispers rose. In every corridor, the voices of Umidia, of Demetra, of brothers slain moments ago by their own kin. The fleet seemed to groan under the weight of it. Crannan survived the schism, but something in him did not. Anzo saw it plainly in the hours that followed. The chapter master walked the blood-slick decks of the Red Honor as master still, issuing casualty tallies, ordering compartments sealed, consolidating the remaining companies, but the last illusion had been stripped from him. The Crimson Sabres could no longer pretend to be wounded loyalists awaiting vindication. The fracture was not one of manpower or fleet strength. It was spiritual. The chapter had split along the line between what it had been and what it was willing to become. The survivors answered that truth by mutilating memory. White shoulder guards were repainted in duller hues or smeared over with ash-black script. Purity seals judged hypocritical were ripped free and cast into furnace grates. Aquila icons were filed, down where they had become reminders rather than comforts. Old oaths were burned and replaced with new, harsher vows written in blood and machine oil. Some brothers kept their honors. Others stripped every badge from their armor until they looked less like scions of a proud chapter than executioners dragged from a mass grave. Anzo watched one veteran take a blade to the white field of his pauldron and scratch it over with deep gouges until bare underplate showed through like exposed bone. "What are you doing?" Anzo asked. The veteran did not look up. "Cauterizing," he said. That was the language now. Not remembrance, not mourning. Cauterization, excision, utility. Manon encouraged it by silence, if not outright decree. New wards appeared over old heraldry. Relics once locked away for doctrinal impurity now hung at belts, and from gorgets because they worked, or seemed to work, or because desperation made any promise of control irresistible. Purity had become a memory too, painful to touch directly. Their next campaign came quickly, as if the galaxy itself had smelled blood in the split and moved to exploit it. A rebel enclave world on the fringe of the eye, filled with warring tribes, half-human militias, and the rusting remnants of imperial colonies gone feral, presented little strategic value. It possessed no major shipyards, no vital gate, no fortress complex worth the loss rates. In the old days, the Crimson Sabres would have passed it by, or struck only those targets required by campaign logic. This time they descended because the whispering had become unbearable. No one said so aloud in formal command. The orders spoke of denial operations, of cleansing a potential hostile recruitment basin, of securing munitions and supply. Yet every brother who boarded the Thunderhawks knew the truth. They were not going to that world because it mattered. They were going because the dead in their skulls would not cease, and battle still purchased silence. They came down in fire across mud settlements and scrap-built keeps. Bolters tore apart men who had never heard of Umidia or Demetra, and could not have threatened the chapter in any meaningful sense. Chainswords opened bellies. Flamers rolled through trench hamlets and burned the screaming inhabitants into black heaps. Crannan's warriors advanced without haste, without fury, without the old necessity of proving anything to the Imperium or even to themselves. They slaughtered because each fresh death drove the voices back for another blessed span of moments. Anzo stood amid the ruins of a settlement that had been no more than rusted walls, prayer flags, and starving men with autoguns. Blood ran in the dust around his boots. The dead lay in heaps against the breach points, faces frozen in terror and bewilderment. Around him, the remaining Sabers moved in grim silence, listening to the sudden quiet inside their own minds, with a hunger that no ration, no victory, no sermon could ever satisfy again. He knew then that a threshold had been crossed far worse than exile. They no longer killed for strategy. They no longer killed for loyalty. They killed because they needed the dead to shut up. The Chamber of War had once been a strategium fit for a loyal chapter of the Adeptus Astartes. Now it resembled a crypt in which command had survived by refusing to die. Reactor glow bled through iron grills in the deck and painted the lower air with a furnace-red shimmer. Votive fires guttered in brass cages, nailed to pillars of blackened adamant. Their smoke crawled along the ceiling in greasy layers, mingling with the stink of machine oil, old blood, ozone, wet incense, and the faint, sweet reek of corrupted flesh, never fully scrubbed from armor seals. Servo skulls drifted through the murk, with parchment strips trailing from their jaws like torn tongues. Above the command dais hung the chapter standards, but no standard remained clean. Crimson fields were darkened by void soot. White trim had yellowed, cracked and gone brown with years of neglect and gore. Aquily glimmered beneath knife marks, filed edges and fresh sigils worked over old sanctity. The survivors stood before the dais in silence. They no longer looked like the scions of a stern but loyal chapter. They looked like relics dragged out of an ancient battlefield and forced back into motion. Armor had been patched with enemy plate taken from renegades, pirates, heretics, and things that had once worn a man's shape. Shoulder guards no longer matched cleanly across squads. Some helms retained the old white stripe and battle honors of the Crimson Sabers. Others had been painted over with jagged kill script and marks of campaigns fought where no imperial chronicle would ever reach. Dried blood filled the seam lines of gauntlets. Purity seals hung in tatters or had been torn away entirely, leaving pale scars of adhesive and sanctified wax like peeled skin. Anzo Riegler stood among the remnants of what had once been the 10th and saw ruin wearing the posture of order. He knew most of the faces still. That was the worst part. Brother Halvek, who had once corrected aspirants for imprecision in catechism recital, now bore a chain of finger bones across his gorget and stared at nothing when battle was not upon him. Sergeant Vortan still stood with parade ground rigidity, but there was a tremor in his jaw each time the chamber fell too quiet. Manon stood off to one side of the dais, robed and gaunt and hollow-eyed, psychic hood folded down but not absent, new talismans hanging from his belt like condemned things. There was no longer any clean border between the chief librarian and what the warp had made of him. He had become a man draped in sanctioned necessity until necessity itself stank of sorcery. Cranon mounted the dais, and the entire chamber tightened around him. He wore the same armor that had once led a loyal chapter in the Emperor's name, yet nothing about him remained untouched. Fresh crimson lacquer had been laid over plate that had survived the blockade, the Hellworld trenches, the civil bloodletting aboard the fleet, and 100 butcheries beyond. It could not conceal the truth beneath. Knife grooves scored the aquila upon his chest, where someone, perhaps Cranon himself, had tried and failed to decide whether to remove it. His cloak was dark with old blood. His face, bare to the chamber, was gaunter than before, the lines around his mouth cut deep by sleeplessness and constant inner war. No one spoke until he did. "The Imperium cast judgment," Cranon said. His voice was iron dragged across stone. "It named us traitors. It burned our home. It put our serfs and dependents to the sword. It sent our brothers to die beneath the guns of those we once called allies. That sentence stands. We have heard it in vox static, in naval fire, in the mouths of every servant of terror that still survives long enough to speak our name." He let the silence take the next breath and sharpen it. "The dead have passed their own judgment as well. They speak without mercy. They name no mitigating doctrine. They grant no distinction between intention and result. They do not forget. They do not forgive." Anzo felt the whispering stir behind his thoughts, as if the words had called it up from the cracks in his mind. Around the chamber, helms tilted by fractions, fists clenched. No man there had been spared that intimate torment. Cranon's gaze moved over them all. "The old name has become a lie." The sentence sank deeper than any oath. Somewhere in the ranks a low growl escaped a brother before discipline crushed it. Cranon went on. "The Sabers are buried in the worlds we burned." There was no triumph in it, no dark exaltation, no moment of reveling coronation beneath an unclean star. Only exhausted fury and the bleak honesty of a man who had finally found one truth he could no longer cut his way around. He stood not as a conqueror claiming a new dominion, but as the executioner of his own lineage. The chapter that bore that name is dead. It died by pride. It died by inflexibility. It died by the hand that sought purity so hard it mistook slaughter for righteousness. It died on Umidia. It died again on Demetra. It died aboard these ships when brother killed brother to preserve the shape of an honor already hollow. His voice lowered. I will not speak the dead name as though it still lives. A figure moved from the front ranks then, one of the surviving company captains, Barkman of the 6th, his armor caked in trench mud, turned black by age and blood. His face was taut with strain. The whispers had eaten hard at him. Anzo had seen it in the man's eyes for many campaigns now, ambition and madness and grievance twisting together under the pressure of the dead. Then you kill more than a name, Barkman said. Every eye in the chamber turned. Cranon did. Not. He had already fixed upon the speaker the instant the man shifted weight. Barkman stepped forward another pace. You speak as though this fall were yours to own. It is not. If the chapter is dead, then perhaps another hand should guide what rises from its grave. The challenge was naked. Manon did not intervene. No chaplain spoke. The chamber understood the old law beneath all the newer ruin. Authority, once questioned in such a moment, would be answered by blood, or not at all. Cranon descended from the dais one step. You mistake your hunger for worth, he said. Barkman drew his blade. Then they were upon one another. The duel was brief, because Cranon had long ago ceased being the man Barkman thought he might overtake. Steel screamed. Barkman struck hard and fast, rage making him reckless. Cranon turned the first blow, took the second on the outer edge of his pauldron in a spray of sparks, then stepped inside the third with brutal exactness. His sword flashed, once in a flat horizontal arc. Barkman stopped moving. For the span of a heartbeat, he remained upright, eyes wide in disbelief, mouth working around words that would never form. Then the upper half of him slid from the lower and hit the deck in a hot red collapse. Entrails and both hearts burst free in a steaming tangle. The lower half toppled a moment later, armor ringing hollowly on the iron floor, while blood ran between the deck grills and hissed on the reactor heat below. No one moved to claim the corpse. Cranon looked down at the two pieces, and then back at his gathered warriors. This is what remains, he said. Not the Crimson Sabers, not a chapter awaiting pardon, not martyrs in waiting. We are the slaughter left behind when duty has been flayed of innocence and still goes on killing. He raised his blade, Barkman's blood dripping black-red from the edge. From this hour, the dead name is sealed. You stand with me as the Crimson Slaughter. The words should have felt like a blasphemy shouted in victory. Instead, they sounded like a grave being closed. No cheers answered, no exultation, only the cold assent of men too far gone to mistake naming for redemption. Fists struck breastplates, helms bowed, oaths were murmured, not in joy, but in the manner of condemned men signing another confession because all previous confessions had failed to spare them. Anzo bowed with the rest. He hated that he did not know whether it was obedience or surrender. Their first full war beneath the new name came soon enough, because war was all that remained to shape them. A subsector on the ragged fringe of the eye had become a knot of competing fortresses, pirate principalities, renegade militias, and stranded imperial enclaves still trying to hold to laws the galaxy had already laughed at. Convoys moved between void docks and hive moons under constant raiding. Orbital bastions traded fire above worlds where billions of souls lived and died without hope of relief. It was a region made for the kind of murder the newly named warband had become expert in. They struck it as a horror opera, written in steel and arterial spray. In the void, the ambush began with silence. Blacked-out escorts drifted among debris fields until convoy augurs passed over them and read them as wreckage. Then the Crimson Slaughter ignited engines and launched. Boarding torpedoes hammered into cargo cruisers and defense frigates alike. Assault craft tore through flak bursts and disgorged red-armored killers into compartments where crews still believed themselves under ordinary pirate attack. There was nothing ordinary in what followed. Anzo went through the flank dock of an escort vessel behind a breaching charge that turned the first pressure door into molten shrapnel. Naval armsmen waited beyond, ranks half-formed, shotguns and las rifles up, mouths open in warning or prayer. His carbine barked. The first line came apart in geysers of blood and ribs. Brother Halvek waded in beside him with chain blade roaring, opening a petty officer from chin to pelvis and spilling the man's organs steaming across the deck, while the next blow hacked an armsman's helm open and sent skull fragments pinwheeling into a bank of cogitators. A serf collapsed to his knees and tried to crawl away through the blood. A bolt round burst his spine and sprayed the bulkhead with nerve pulp. Further inboard, terminators broke the bridge. Power fists pulped officers in command thrones. Storm bolters turned command crews into clots of meat and shredded uniform cloth. The ship's master tried to ram the self-scuttle code and lost his arm at the elbow for it. Crannan took the man's head a moment later and kicked the body from the pulpit so his own warriors might stand in its blood. The victory should have tasted glorious. It was clean, decisive, absolute. Instead, the moment the last defenders were dead and the firing ceased, the voices came back louder than before. They came because the corpses were fresh. Men Anzo had never seen alive whispered his name. Crewmen from the escort ship drowned his thoughts with pleas he had not heard while killing them. Elsewhere in the Voxnet, brothers snarled and cursed and demanded immediate redeployment before the pressure built any worse. One of the chaplains began reciting a catechism of penitence so loudly over the command channel that another officer had to mute him. This was the truth of the curse. It had no bottom. It was not silenced by slaughter. It was only fed. The campaign widened. Mass landings followed upon hive moons and fortress worlds. The Crimson Slaughter came down through anti-air fire in crimson drops and spread through hab blocks, refinery towers and bastion trenches with the cold professionalism of veteran murderers. Power swords split helms open from crown to jaw, exposing brains that steamed in the poisoned air before the owners had even fully fallen. Bolter rounds burst. Torsos apart inside corridor bottlenecks, painting lumen strips and prayer plaques with gobbets of heart, lung and shattered vertebrae. Entire hab blocks became meat houses, every room breached, every stairwell clogged with dead, every corridor running slick enough that armored boots slipped in the slurry of blood and pulverized tile. At the bastion of Goal, Crannan led the main breach through a gatehouse defended by militia in old Imperial colors and renegade enforcers fighting side by side because survival had made all distinctions meaningless. It should have been a heroic storming, the kind of action sung by remembrances in another age. Instead, it became butcher's work of a scale fit for the age that truly existed. Melter charges opened the gate. The first rank of defenders vanished in a burst of white fire, armor and flesh slumping into burning fat. Assault marines plunged through the breach on jump pack flame and landed amid the surviving defenders like descending engines of dismemberment. One man took a chainsword through the mouth and came off it as red ribbons and teeth. Another had both legs severed at the knee by a sweeping power axe and tried to pull himself backward through the blood before a bolt round detonated in his chest and scattered his upper body over the barricade. Rhino columns shoved through the broken gate and crushed the wounded under their tracks, grinding bodies into the churned earth until the ground beneath them resembled butchered offal spread thin across stone. Within the inner hab sectors, the fighting grew even filthier. Families, labor gangs, and off-duty militia had taken shelter in chapel basements and storage warrens. The Crimson slaughter cleared them anyway, because movement behind fortifications was threat, because fear could become uprising, because no one among them any longer possessed the will or even the vocabulary to separate tactical necessity from the habit of extermination. Doors blew in, flamers reduced, chamber air to liquid fire. Men trying to shield one another burned down to black, crouched shapes, still clutching at their own faces. Shot through the smoke came the voices of the newly dead, joining the old choir in the skulls of the killers. Anzo moved through it all and understood with perfect clarity what they had become. That clarity was his final punishment, because it did not free him. He could see the whole chain now. Discipline had become inflexibility. Purity had become self-righteousness. Vengeance had become identity. Efficiency had made genocide easy. Every virtue they had polished until it gleamed had sharpened into the instrument of their damnation. They had not been corrupted by sudden temptation. They had been perfected into monstrosity by qualities they had once mistaken for strength beyond reproach. That was why there was no road back. When the bastion finally fell and the enemy banners were dragged down from its towers, Cranon stood amid the ruins as conqueror, over a battlefield vast enough to have satisfied any old dream of martial glory. Void docks burned above. The fortress guns were silent. The defenders lay in drifts against the walls and choke points, a continent of dead in microcosm. His warriors held the heights. The campaign was victory beyond challenge. Then the killing stopped. The aftermath was not triumph. It was screaming. Not outside. Inside. Every mind in the warband opened under the weight of accumulated dead. The voices of Umidia and Demetra, of traitor marines and mutant hordes, of naval ratings and fortress militia, of laborers burned in basements, and priests cut down in queues, and brothers split apart by brothers in the fleet schism. They all spoke at once, pleading, accusing, weeping, laughing, cursing, naming, remembering, asking why, and never waiting for answer. A veteran tore off his helm and slammed his head into a wall until ceramite cracked. Another dropped to one knee in the midst of the Victory Plaza and fired bolt rounds into corpses because some broken reflex told him more death might restore quiet. Manon staggered and clutched at a pillar, blood running in black lines from his nose, while his hood sparked with caged lightning. Cranon himself stood rigid as a statue, face contorted not in physical pain, but in the knowledge that no triumph could ever fill the pit now living inside them. The curse had no bottom. It could always be fed more. Night fell over the broken bastion, and the Crimson Slaughter held it as masters over a kingdom of bones and flame. Anzo stood atop the wall walk, where the wind carried the stink of opened corpses and promethium smoke over miles of slaughter. Beside him, Brother Silas watched the pyres being lit below. "We did not fall," Silas said at last. Anzo's eyes remained on the dead city. "No," he said, "we perfected the fall." Below them, the warband moved among the corpses in armor, stained almost black, old white heraldry sullied. Beyond recovery, icons altered, names erased, vows rewritten in the language of survival and blood. The Crimson Sabers were gone. Nothing in the galaxy could exhume them. In their place stood something more enduring and more terrible, a host of killers who had found that damnation required no revelation, only repetition. In a galaxy built on massacre, that was enough. The Crimson Slaughter endured, and damnation had merely found a new uniform.